This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by Atom Audio, Isotope, Native Instruments, Lewitt, and Grace Design. You're hearing my voice right now on the new Lewitt Ray microphone with Aura, Auto Gain, and EQ mode through the Grace Design M201 Mark II mic pre, mixed through Isotope, Voice Enhancement Assistant RX, Ozone, Neutron, and Nectar on Atom Audio monitors. Please check out our awesome sponsors using the links in the show notes. It's a great way to help support this show. Now get ready to rock.
You've got a live band in the studio, you're press and record. That first take that they do always has some magic to it. It's not always the one that you keep, but there's always something like the energy of the first take. It's everyone's going at it with their fresh ideas, with the energy and stuff. Some of that can still apply even all the way to mastering. Yeah, I listen to it, I make some notes, do a bunch of processing. Whatever I'm doing first is almost always my best foot forward.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Hey, rock stars. Yeah, you. I've got a secret to tell you. Want to know how I get a consistent sound mixing over 1,000 hours of recording studio rock stars? Well, my secret is using Isotope, RX, Ozone, Neutron, Voice Enhancement Assistant, and Nectar to make every episode of this podcast sound great. Right now, you're hearing RX breath control, D-click, D-clip, DS, D-plosive, voice denoise, Ozone multiband compression, Neutron EQ, VEA, and limiting, all from Isotope. Use the secret code ROCK10 to get 10% off or pick up the new Trash Light along with many of the other free cool plugins over at isotope.com. Are you recording your own music or other people's music in your studio, but you're having trouble figuring out how to get your mixes to sound great? Do they sound kind of weak or distant or lack punch and clarity? Well, I've got a gift to help you take your mixes from sounding like basement demos to sounding much closer to professional mixes. And it's my free course called Mix Master Bundle. This course will show you how to get pro-sounding mixes from your home studio with free and stock plugins in Pro Tools, and the best part is that these mixing techniques work for you in any DAW, whether you're on Logic, Cubase, Studio One, Reaper, anything you can think of. If you're ready now to make your best record ever, then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now, and you can find the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. Howdy, Rockstars. It's your host, Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Joe Hutchinson, a mastering engineer at Garage Masters in Nashville, Tennessee, where Joe has been providing mastering services for over 10 years. Joe works in a well-designed room built in 2022 and uses a combination of analog and digital tools to give each song or project what it needs. Every project is different, and what happens in mastering can vary from heavy-handed processing to being almost transparent. Often mastering will catch little things missed in the production and mixing process, since a mastering engineer offers a fresh set of ears and in that sense acts as the quality control at the end of the recording process. Joe was my mastering engineer at the Hay Bale Studio at Bonnaroo, which I ran for 15 years, and he did many of those years with me at the end, and has been a guest on the podcast for episode RSR454. Wow, that's going way back, where you can hear Joe's backstory. So if you want to hear some of that, go back and check out that episode. We'll leave a link in the playlist as well. Today, we're going to talk about what's new in mastering, see what we can learn for our own studios as well, and hear what's going on over at Garage Masters. Please welcome back Joe Hutchinson to Recording Studio Rockstars. Joe, my brother, are you ready to rock?
Oh yeah, I'm ready. Thanks for having me, Lidge.
Glad to have you here, dude. I'm trying to remember, I know we all kind of had like fun nicknames when we were doing the Bonnaroo studio. What was yours again?
Oh yeah. Mine was, I think Crispy Joe was one of them. I don't remember why.
Yeah, it sounds like some like bad description of the sound, but I don't. It certainly wasn't that.
I couldn't tell you. No way. Everything we did sounded great.
Yeah, that was fun, man. So, what did we do, man? Let's remind the rock stars what it was.
What did we do? Yeah.
What do you remember about it?
It was it was kind of a chaotic week of packing up a whole studio and building it in a single wide trailer surrounded in hay bales backstage behind a festival ongoing, and bands would come in and play through their songs live, and Lidge would mix it live, almost like, a live engineer would mix a live show, but he's doing it on headphones, and, it's kind of, riding everything, effects and all that. And I'm recording a stereo mix while it's happening and just kind of listening and making notes. Then I would chop it up they'd usually do 3 songs, chop it up into 3 songs and master it almost in real time. I would get to listen to it maybe one time after the recording and just as quickly as I could. And then, it is what it is. And
do you remember?
Yeah.
Do you remember part of that process being that hearing the mix go down, you already had ideas about what you wanted to do with the master or something like that?
Yeah, I think so. And that's, usually I would, if I felt like I heard something, I would try to make a note. But, there wasn't time to do a whole lot of like, I couldn't get into like crazy automation or whatever. And I had to do everything in the box because there's no, I'd be, recording it while it was happening. I'd get to listen to it maybe one time while the first band's loading out, the next band's loading in, and then I'd have to bounce it while the next band is like sound checking. And I kind of I almost want to be paying attention. So, I had to be in the box for that reason. But it was it was pretty interesting. Very different.
Some of the fun moments I remember about that were a band would record with us. They do a few songs and then they'd go into the next part of the studio for the interview. Sometimes they came back out through our studio, or sometimes they just hadn't walked into the next bit yet. And they're already hearing what they just did come out of your speakers as you're mastering. You like turn the speakers up. And man, it was fun to see some of like their face would just light up. They're like, damn, that sounds great. Yeah, it was cool. Sometimes people would say like, that sounds better than our record. And I was like, all right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know always how true that was because, maybe they're just like excited in the moment. They probably, if they listen again, they'd realize, oh, maybe that vocal tuning on our record was helpful.
Right. No, but it was fun. And there's something cool about, live music, and that was live music just in a controlled environment. But it's the band's only playing it once. It's like mistakes and all. It's just out there. But often there's like magic in that one take thing. So I think that was really cool in its own right, and maybe that's part of why they all enjoyed it. But that stuff was fun. That was a lot of fun.
Another thing that was particular about what we did was all the microphones would come to the console. At least some of the sessions that I did with you, we were still taking an analog console down there.
Yeah.
And that was my favorite way to do it.
Yeah.
And so those mics would go through the analog console and then they'd get mixed down. I'd have to mix in headphones. You'd be listening in headphones in the back. I'd forgotten that you were like actually the 2-track also. You're like recording the actual mix.
Yeah.
And then you'd master it from there. And there was a quality to the sound that you kind of have to hear it to believe it. It's like when you don't take individual tracks and send them to a tape machine has a quality that's awesome. But, we're all used to taking individual tracks to our DAW and then mixing it together in a digital form and trying to get that as good as we can. But there's something so pure about mixing it analog, and the only thing that gets captured is the 2-track. And it, particularly like in high-end detail and like simple clarity, like where you don't necessarily have to boost the highs, you just hear detail and things because it never goes away. And then also like a low-end transparency that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, the analog thing is definitely cool. I loved those years when we had the SSL desk a couple years, and you had what was your console that we brought?
It's actually below you in the basement right now. You're like if you fell through the floor, you'd land on it. It's the Soundcraft DC2000.
That console is cool though.
Yeah,
you had some great sounding stuff come off that.
Yeah, that one was surprisingly one of our best sounding boards that we ever took down there too. And then at the very end, we took the PreSonus Studio Live 64 digital console. And that was really fun too, to essentially figure out how to start doing the same thing with the digital board. And it really did sound great. There's a magic that happens in an all analog thing, but it's amazing how great the digital boards sound. And also, I think if we had been comparing like a mix off of a multi-track DAW in an analog board versus a digital board, it might be harder to discern the difference,
Yeah, I think so. Because stuff, converters and plugins and everything in the digital realm has come such a long way that it's like there's really great stuff out there, And
yeah. Okay, cool. Well, that was then. This is now.
Yeah.
Tell us about Garage Masters.
Well, it's just me, really. I may hire an assistant one of these days. But it's just my mastering business. Built a studio last year behind our house. Niles Acoustics and Design built it. Josh Niles is a studio builder here in town. Did really great work. I'm super happy with how it turned out. The design and just how it sounds. It's a lot of fun. But yeah, just been doing that. And
what did you guys do for your
a little over a year?
What? So you did this redesign in 2022. Maybe just break it down for us a little bit. Like what goes into designing a mastering studio?
There are like a couple different ways you can do it. And in my case, my room is built inside another structure. So I didn't build a building for my studio. I already had. It's essentially like a giant garage, or it's actually a pole barn.
Is that why it's called Garage Masters?
Well, I've been in several different garages converted into studios, so the name originated from a different garage, but it sticks. It's on theme.
Do you ever say garage? Garage Masters?
I don't know.
Garage Masters. Okay, cool. So you guys built it in a garage space, which, if we think of a garage, we think of walls that may or may not have insulation even. And then we think of a garage door, which might not be a very thick
No,
thing,
so what we did is it really is a pole barn that the previous owner of our house built behind his house and used as a garage. So it has 2 garage doors. There is insulation and electricity already in the building, but it's not like super thick insulation, but it is there.
And what's a pole barn?
Pole barn, it's just a barn built on a concrete slab that has a little bit of something in it. It's not completely bare bones, Right. In this case, like I said, insulation and a little bit of like metal sheeting as the side.
So does when you're inside looking at a wall, do you see what looks like normal drywall, or do you see the studs and the insulation?
You see the studs and the insulation.
Right, okay.
The rest outside of my studio. So my studio is basically in the middle of this larger structure. My studio is it's not super big. It's probably 10 by 14 or something, and the ceilings are 9 or 10 feet high, somewhere in that realm. And then outside of the room, eventually I'll build a lobby out there, and I just haven't done it yet.
So the garage itself was 10 by 14, or no? That's the size.
That's the size of my room. That's inside. Right. The whole structure is 30 by 30, so it's pretty large. And I'm kind of right in the middle. And we just built a room. Like the floors are floating, so it's off the ground a couple inches, and just kind of built. They sealed off the garage door, and then built my room just kind of in the middle of the room, and it's pretty cool. It just feels, it's funny kind of walking into this unfinished structure and then into this nice studio right in the middle of it. It feels funny sometimes. But
so what do you think are similarities or differences between building a recording studio and maybe control room versus something that's for mastering? I mean, are there some slightly different requirements on things?
Well, I primarily looked more at getting the best sounding room, like the least issues with, reflections and everything. So the way my room is built, it's not a square or a rectangle. It's kind of, the walls aren't really parallel at any point. They're all kind of at slight angles. So where I sit is kind of the walls on either side are almost parallel, and then right at the sitting point, they both kind of come in at not 45-degree angles, but pretty significant angles And then there's kind of some bass traps built behind my monitors. And then there's like the front wall, which kind of has a bunch of diffusers and stuff built in. And then the back wall is like a couple feet of insulation, which kind of the whole back wall is like a giant bass trap with, diffusers in the front, like above the couch that's in the back of my room. And then even the ceiling is like at an angle. It's not flat, so it's especially if you see it from the outside, it's even weirder looking because, none of the walls, it doesn't just look like flat drywall like you'd see in a house or in a typical scenario.
From the outside. So the outside means you could be standing in the original garage looking at the other side of the wall of your control room.
Right. Example. When you walk into the garage or the barn, you see, you can just see kind of how the angles all work cool. On the outside of the drywall and stuff.
And just as a reminder, Rockstars, so Joe described starting with a 30 by 30 garage, which, you might instinctively go, wow, it's nice big space. But there's a couple of thoughts about that. There's a couple of thoughts, yeah. So one is 30 by 30 is a lot of space, and space volume can be good for low end in playback systems because it lets it disperse a little more and it like extends the low frequencies, right? But a square is a terrible design for a listening space because you're doubling up on the nodes or the modes rather of the 30 and the 30. So like you coming up with a design to build a rectangle inside that space means you're getting a more like even dispersion of the low frequency information coming from the speakers, right?
Right. And also there's like in this garage, there's like a loft kind of around the outside of it. And the loft is only about 7 feet high. So what I wanted to do was build the ceilings a little bit higher for my space. So I had way less than 30 feet, if that makes sense. I had, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet to actually build the space because if that, maybe less than that, just because the loft being lower and wanting to have higher ceilings. And I didn't, and the loft is great for storage just for general life. So I didn't want to get rid of that either. Plus it's enough space for me. It's just me in there working by myself. I don't need a
Now, what about other
room.
Considerations? So like if you're recording bands, you're thinking about like drum sets that don't need to bother neighbors, or you're thinking about, quiet vocal mics and acoustics that will be turned way up where you're like, you don't want to hear the lawnmower from your neighbor coming into your recording. That must change a little bit when you're thinking about a mastering setup.
Sure. Well, you don't really want outside sound coming in either for mastering setup. And my room is well insulated. I can't really hear anything from the outside world inside there, except maybe, if there's some giant machinery that's, super, super low end and it's like parked right next to my house. Like I might hear a slight rumble if everything's quiet, but like I wouldn't hear it while I'm working.
Yeah.
And obviously you wouldn't want to hear any of that in a recording space as well. You'd probably, maybe go a little harder on the isolation of
because
outside.
If you stick a mic in somewhere, you might have to
turn
gain
it up
mic
a ton.
up like crazy. I mean, that's the thing we need to remember. I think when we think about these spaces is that like we're hyper exaggerating some things and other things we're not doing that at all. Like a microphone might be hyper gained so that the smallest sound becomes bigger than life.
Right.
And so it can invade it. Whereas like in a listening environment, you're listening to the speakers, but you might want to like turn the speakers down low, but not, just naturally in the space, not have any competition of some other sound coming in.
Right.
You don't want to hear a low end and think it's coming out of the speakers when it in fact was some other truck driving by or something like that, right?
Right. Yeah. But I mean, it's great. It's well isolated. I don't really have problems with like, hearing outside noise coming in and messing up what I'm doing. And I don't bother the neighbors or anything. It's isolated enough to where I don't listen super loud, but it's, it definitely could be audible if I didn't have any treatment.
And then you said you did a floated floor too. What's that all about? How do you describe that?
I'm not a huge acoustics expert myself, but it's basically you build the floor, the 2x4s that kind of make up the subfloor sits on these little things I think they're called U-boats. They're like rubber. They just look like kind of the letter U. And so the 2x4, the 2-inch side sits inside these U-boats, and that's kind of how the whole like framing of the floor sits. And so they're probably, I don't know, an inch thick or something. I'm making all this up. I could be totally wrong. I don't know. I mean, I kind of, I walked in as they were building it, but I don't, there's a reason I hired someone to build my studio and I didn't try to do it myself. It's because my knowledge only goes so far. But
essentially it isolates your new floor from the floor below, which is probably like a concrete slab of
it is a concrete slab
garage. And that means that, I guess that would mean that low frequency energy doesn't translate through the materials from one to the other.
Yeah, right. Which is really great. And that was something that I definitely wanted, which is cool.
What about your monitors? Talk to us about like setting up your monitors in the space. And did you have to get particular about the stands for the speakers or any of that kind of stuff too?
I already had all that stuff. But yeah, I have Atomic Instruments 610s.
Ooh, those are nice.
They're and then I use a Trinov. If you're familiar with Trinov,
oh yeah,
it's,
cool.
The kind of the nth degree of a SonarWorks kind of idea. It's a box. It really is just kind of a computer in a box. Just like a rack mounted thing that corrects your room / your monitors and just kind of fixes the little. It's more, I just kind of use it for fine tuning because there's a lot of energy in the Atomics that I like and they are full range, but there's some stuff, there's like definitely a little bit of high flow end and kind of a few dips in certain areas in the mid range. And I would prefer it to be pretty much totally flat. And so that's what I'm using the Trinov for, is to flatten them out.
Right. It kind of digitally compensates for the little quirks of the actual space and speaker setup and everything.
Yeah. Which, I mean, the room itself, it just sounds amazing. It just sounds like nothing almost, which is great.
Yeah,
I love it.
Well, Atomics really are amazing speakers. I remember hearing those and just being like, wow, they sound fucking great. And that's the way I thought about it. It's like they reminded me of listening to, vintage component stereos that also have this quality that I like, just can be really appealing sounding,
Yeah.
And so an Atomic the 610s, for example, if I remember correctly, they don't do any digital processing in the speaker, whereas a lot of modern active speakers do use digital stuff to kind of straighten themselves out.
Right.
The Atomics are totally analog crossovers and amp designs and stuff. Is that right?
Yeah. It's all very analog. And I think they're great. I will probably upgrade my speakers at some point, but I just built a studio, so I got to save up a little more.
Yeah. One step at a time.
Speaker upgrade. I mean, everything I buy at this point is like buying a new car. It's all like 30, 40 grand. So
No matter what style of music you make, Native Instruments gives your studio all the instruments you need. From drums, loops, and beats to the coolest synthesizers, realistic strings, guitar amps, and futuristic synth pads. I love to record real bands in my studio, but then I mix it up with cool sounds from Contact, Massive X, Super 8, Battery, Guitar Rig, and Hybrid Keys, for example, to make my music way more exciting and interesting. Use the coupon code ROCK10 for 10% off, or download the free gifts waiting for you, like the awesome new Jacob Collier Audience Choir or Complete Start, featuring 2,000 sounds and 6 gigs of free samples at nativeinstruments.com. So talk a little bit about that. When you do upgrade, I think it's important for us to be reminded that, sometimes we think about recording in studios in black and white, where it's like, it's either, the first thing we have or it's like the ultimate thing. And it's not like that at all. It's like iterations of what we use and the tools, and some aspects of new stuff we feel are like a great improvement over where we were. And I think ultimately we just sort of like learn this new tool, like once we've built it, right?
Yeah.
What was your experience when you built your studio and started mastering again? Did you Did you have like a holy shit, this is so much fun moment? Or
I mean, I love it. I also love, and I think this, is not technically an audio thing, but I love the design of the room. And so it's just inspiring for me to be in the room. But I think that's important, at least it is for me, to kind of be in the right headspace of like, oh man, the vibe is right in here. It doesn't feel like sterile or, like boring or anything. It's just, I love being in the room. And that just kind of inspires me to kind of, do my thing and not, it doesn't feel as much like, oh, here we go again. It's like going into, because I used to rent a space and the space I rented was great. And honestly, it looked great and had, this giant window, which I do kind of miss that. But
did you consider trying to include natural light in your studio? Or
I have a small window.
Interesting. So there'd be a small window to the garage and you just
basically
double it with one going into
the garage door had a window, or I installed a window, like a window pane in the garage door. And then they built kind of all the isolation between the garage door and the studio to seal it off. And so there's the window in the garage door, and then there's like a couple feet of space. And then I have another window in the studio, but it's like tinted glass. So it kind of almost looks like a light box in the studio. I can't actually see what's outside, but natural light comes in, and that's like, I think, really cool because it kind of helps it, feel not as much like you're in a basement or in a garage.
Yeah, because it is a weird experience when you start doing this and you realize that your days are, you can spend a whole day in a studio space and not have a sense of it being day.
Right.
Which is like kind of exciting and fun when you're in your, late teens, early 20s, and it's like this just adventure and you want to stay up all night anyway.
Yeah.
But then sometimes as you turn it into a career, you're like, do I want to experience the daytime somehow too? So it's smart to like figure out a clever way to do that. I know I've seen, when I was looking at my studio design, and I think maybe even just thinking about my house and getting more light into my house, I learned about all these cool things like tubes that will bring sunlight they'll go up to the roof, and instead of a skylight, it's just like a little light catcher, and it'll
that's
bring
cool.
it down a tube and into the room, or you could bring it down, fiber optic kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Rods, and then it like spread it out in a little fiber light fixture or something. So that stuff could probably be a really fun way to do it too. But
dang, that's really cool.
Pricey.
That's really cool. Yeah. Dang.
We got some natural light in this room right now.
We got two great windows in here. This is great, Lidge.
Yeah, isn't it nice? And then I opened this one so you could see the view.
I love it.
Fall out
This is wonderful.
Hopefully Doobie won't start barking while we're doing this. But so Rockstars, we're in recording RSR HQ right now. I haven't quite named it yet, but the new podcasting studio up in the house, which is a fun way to do interviews. It's like an actual conversation.
This is nice.
It sounds great. All right, so let's see, what else has been important for you in your studio? You said it's a mixture of analog and digital tools. So like what kind of stuff, what are some of the tools that surround you when you're sitting in your workspace? Yeah.
So I have, I have a desk with racks in it, like you'll often see with, some rack gear, some analog gear. I have a tape machine that I've been using a lot more recently. I have quite a few people I work with that want that on pretty much everything. And so there's a lot of, producers or mix guys I work with who send me stuff.
What's the tape machine?
They kind of want, it's a Mara Machines Restore JH110. Didn't you used to have a JH110?
I did. I sold it to Mara Machines. Maybe you got my Restore
Well, wouldn't
machine?
That be funny?
That would be awesome.
Yeah. Actually, I'm sure you remember this. I came in and rented your studio and did something to tape years ago.
I do remember
before
that.
I had a tape machine.
I had forgotten it, but as I was getting ready for this, I just typed your name into my little storage files and like I'll pop these photos of us doing a little photo analog session in the studio.
Yeah, that was fun. Maybe that started the itch for me of like, oh, I got to get one of these.
It might be, man. Well, I'm sure the tape machine is working better now. If it went to Chris Mara and then to you, it should be in great shape. So maybe what is Mara Machines? Tell the rock stars about that.
Mara Machines is, they're based here in Nashville. They buy and restore primarily or maybe entirely MCI machines, and they make, 2-inch machines, 1/2-inch, 1/4-inch, all kinds of stuff. But mine is a 1/4-inch 2-track tape machine, and it's great. They just fix them up, make them, and they refinish them, they repaint them, and kind of brand them like Mara. It's really cool. They do a great job, and they kind of help you if you have any issues. You can talk to them on the phone or via Skype, or they'll even send a tech over if they need to. But they've been super helpful keeping it up to date. I've had mine kind of upgraded a time or two.
Okay, cool. And that is really helpful because with those old machines, they require, some care and attention. It's kind of like having a vintage, antique car or something like that. You can kind of kick them around and get them to just work, enough, but you can also get them dialed into where they're really like in the sweet spot and reliable. And it's nice to have a machine like that. My machines, I had a JH16 and then a JH110. And I worked on it myself a little bit, but it was always like, I was always seating my pants. I was just like, trying to get a sound that was pretty cool for that given day and that session off the tape machine. And it actually used to make me really nervous when I'd get a call like yours, somebody wanting to come in and do a tape transfer, because my answer, of course, was like, sure, I'd love to. And then after I hang up, I'm like, holy jeez, what am I going to do? How am I going to get this thing?
Yeah, hope it works today.
Yeah, I got to have to I just terrified that I'm going to put somebody's tape on the machine and it's going to do something weird. Because tape machines, they can do, they could just go berserk and.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
tape just gets stretched into fiber or something. I don't want to jinx anything here, but it's good to have a well dialed in machine.
I mean, that's definitely the benefit of having one of these refurbished machines. Like mine has been extremely solid, and the issues I have had have been easily resolved. I haven't had anything crazy. So it's been really great. As a whole, it's very consistent. I just get a new reel tape periodically and it's great.
Right. So let's talk about that. So this concept of tape and the periodic need for tape, I think sometimes people still think of analog as like, oh, you have to buy all this tape, but you don't necessarily in this new digital hybrid age, right? Because you wouldn't necessarily keep the stuff on the tape forever. You might just use the tape and then reuse it again tomorrow.
Correct. Yeah. Primarily what I do is I am just kind of printing things through tape. It's going to tape and I'm re-recording it in real time. And so, it's just going through tape, and then I'll reuse the tape several times for, and eventually it becomes audible. That's like, okay, I'm losing a little bit of high end or whatever. It's like, it's time for a new reel. But, if you think about it, like somebody, you've got, depending on what speed you're using, you've got, I don't know, 20, 40 minutes of tape, one of the two, if you're 15 or 30. And if you have some long playing tape, and so you can easily fit quite a few songs. If you get sent singles, you're only using 5 minutes of that tape. And so then the next thing you can go to a different spot on the tape if you want or whatever. But you can also re-record over quite a few times without any really audible change until a certain point. So
I worked in Chicago with Steve Albini, which I've mentioned in the podcast. Sorry to keep name dropping, guys. But but I did ask him at one point, I was like, dude, how many times can you just reuse tape? And he just thought about it for a second. He was like, I don't know, maybe like 1,000 or something.
It's a lot, man. It's a lot.
He was like thinking it should be fine to reuse it. It's just eventually if you're running this physical thing across, then maybe it would wear out. But I used to use my tape. I just use it for years, Mm-hmm. I mean, I wasn't using it every day, but when I would use the multi-track, I would run it and let it just roll, through from top of the tape to the bottom. And then things that were recorded would hit the tape and bounce into the Pro Tools. So I probably used it way more than in your situation where you're just intentionally printing at one time or whatever, you do it the moment you need it. Right. In other words, like in a mastering scenario, it'd be way more predictable when you were going to record the tape versus in my recording situation.
Oh, totally.
It's just like rolling while the band's like figuring out what the hell they're going to do.
Oh yeah. It's quite different. But yeah.
Well, so what does tape do? What do you hear? What are the qualities that it imparts? That's
So
cool.
it does a couple things. It's cool. It has, so you have a few different speeds you can use with tape. You can do either 15 or 30 inches per second. And 30 is kind of a bit more, hi-fi, I guess. While 15 kind of has some different stuff in the mid-range and a definite difference in the low end, I hear on 15. And so I usually do stuff at 15. I will occasionally do stuff at 30 if it feels like it needs to be cleaner. But it just kind of has a cool thing that it does to the mid-range, and also like a nice thing that it does to kind of warm the high end a little bit, especially if you're pushing it. So, and by pushing it, I mean if you're going just slightly above zero and you start getting a little bit of that tape saturation. There's so many plugins out there that emulate tape saturation, but tape itself does react, in a pretty cool way with material. So it kind of rounds off transients in a way, not like gets rid of them, but it just kind of, I don't know. It's some of it is kind of hard to describe, but the way that it sounds, it doesn't work for everything. If you've got like some pop thing or some hip hop thing where you really want your low end to be like big and punchy and stuff, it's like it's not usually right for that.
Right, because it'll soften it.
It will,
change.
But for like an indie thing or like a singer-songwriter thing, it's like sometimes it's just magic.
Drums
in my opinion
too, right? Do you notice the drums particularly sound good coming off of tape?
Yeah, again, in certain genres, I guess, or for certain styles. I mean, I love it, and I'd be down to do almost anything to tape, but some stuff, it doesn't really work.
All right, here's just throwing this out there. But what if the rock stars are like, "Ooh, I'd like to have that tape sound on some of my next record." What would happen if they reached out to them and they were just like, "Hey, can you bounce all these drums off tape for them? Send us back, and we'll keep working on our song."
I mean, it's theoretically possible. I just have a 2-track machine, so it would take me a long time to do.
Oh, well, they'd have to do a stereo.
Yeah, if it was just a stem, yeah, sure. I do that for people sometimes. If somebody's like, hey, can I just pay you something to just print my mix through tape, and like maybe they don't have the budget to have me master it, but like they just want a little bit of tape or whatever
for mastering. So one of the things I remember loving about tape was what it would do to the bass guitar too. It just really makes the bass pleasant. I think about like old, you think about Bob Marley records, you think about dub records and things like that. And I don't know what else comes to mind really when I think about like old school low end, but hip hop was different. That's another thing. We should probably talk about that too, because you've got a great variety of songs in your mastering playlist. And Rockstar's a reminder that we have a playlist of Joe's music. You can just click through and listen to all these records. If you're wanting to check out some of the variety of sounds, or we talk about anything in particular, or if you just want to see what kind of records Joe's making and send your next mastering project. And that link is in the show notes. So please listen to that. But I know that hip hop is, and, rap, I actually don't know what the distinction is anymore. It's all just one and the same. But you're doing a bunch of stuff like that too. And I don't know if you've ever gone and, it's always curious that speaking of low end, you go into, a Spotify or Apple Music or wherever, and you just say like, modern bass music and hip hop versus like old school stuff. And it's like you hear a big shift in the low end. It's like a whole different kind of low end.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Which I guess has a lot to do with just playback systems and vinyl back in the day and things like that now versus all digital. It's like there's this whole new world of bass and low end that exists in music that wasn't even there when we started, it seems like.
Oh, yeah. And at least in my experience over the past, since I've been doing this, a lot of stuff that I've been working on has become increasingly low end heavy. And
because you can.
I mean, and that's fine. I like low end. It's cool. A lot of people like low end.
Let's pick the hardest part of record making and let's focus on that, right?
Yeah. Sometimes someone's like, man, I want this screaming loud and I want all this low. And it's like, well,
Yeah. So talk about that.
Sometimes you do have to pick one.
Is there a little bit of a trade-off, and what does that mean? What is that all about? Why would that even be a thing?
Oh, well, so, low end is kind of the way the human ear hears sound. You're most sensitive to sound in kind of the upper mid-range area of the frequency spectrum. And maybe least sensitive to the sound in like the low end. And so a lot of what maybe sounds like not as much low end physically is actually physically metering, whatever, is quite a bit of low end. And so a lot of people want to crank the low end so that they really feel it. It's like punching or whatever, and that's fine. But you're working with a ceiling. The ceiling is 0 if you're working with, recorded music, and you can't go past 0. So you're in mastering and in mixing, you are using compression, limiting, et cetera, to kind of raise the average level to make it competitive with other stuff that's out there. And low end is kind of the biggest thing that usually eats up a lot of that headroom that you have before you hit 0. Because again, that's the thing that, you're never hitting 0 with like that high mid stuff. That stuff never comes anywhere near 0. But the low end is like kind of constantly at 0. And so it's constantly getting compressed, limited, and eventually you'll start to hear that. It'll either sound compressed or it'll start to sound a little crunchy coming from the limiter or whatever you're using. And so there's kind of a trade-off of like, you can really only push that stuff so far before it starts sounding bad. And then if you want it to get louder, you usually have to start maybe dialing back the low end a little or boosting, high end, high mid stuff to.
Well, it's interesting because I think part of it too is just that, quote, louder in quotes is a perception thing anyway.
It is, yeah.
We perceive something as louder. And so I think that the qualities in audio that make us think this is louder are often things in the mid-range, right?
Right. Yeah, mid-range and high end, I think.
And high end. In 2024, Adam Audio celebrates 25 years of designing industry-leading monitors in Berlin, unveiling the Arctic White A4V and A7V series, available for a limited time. With the XART ribbon tweeter design, customizable speaker voicings, and SonarWorks integration for room correction, these monitors deliver professional-grade sound perfect for Grammy-winning producers and home studios. Make your studio cooler than cool with the Arctic White series and get the Adam Audio A4V and A7V with an extended 5-year warranty at adamaudio.com. Sometimes I listen in the car and I think that my perception of what sounds just right is the right amount of bass and low end and energy coming at me from the music, and then the correct balance of presence of mid-range and high-end. And like, if I could just get those 3 things right, then it sounds great out of the car.
Liz, you're just describing what we're all going for all the time.
Right. And like
if I could just get the perfect balance of how everything sounds, wouldn't that be great? Yeah, it's literally all I do every day is like, let me just get the balance of these things.
Every day is just like, if I could just get this right, dear Lord, let me get this right today.
And right's a moving target too, like what's right for, and this is something that you learn over the years, what is right for you. Sometimes the artist or the producer wants something else. Maybe they want it to be a little bit brighter than what I think sounds good. Mm-hmm. And that's okay, sometimes there can be some back and forth, but ultimately you want to try to get something to a place where it sounds great and also still kind of captures the artist and the producer's vision for the song or their project,
So let's talk about that difference of experience too. So you have the things that you notice and the sound that you get in a control room setting. Do you feel like that is supposed to match the experience that you have in a car setting, for example? Or do you feel like there is a difference and it's smart for us to sort of wrap our brains around that? In other words, a modern car might have lots of low end and a subwoofer in there. And if you're adding bass to mixes, or like just even thinking about like, how are other people listening to this and experiencing it and getting inspired to make music, and then come back to me saying, it needs to sound as good as that,
Totally.
What is that difference between control room versus real world?
Well, so there have been studies done that kind of show that there are obviously a lot of different systems out there, a lot of different ways to listen. Everyone's system is going to sound different, except for the things that people have in common, like people listening on AirPods. AirPods is very common.
What about those people that discover that they have an EQ in their car stereo?
Yeah, that too. Good for them. I mean, car stereos are far from flat, so maybe they're flattening out a bit. They're probably not. But it's kind of like aiming for something that works for what they're going for, as opposed to just like trying to do the same, copy and paste approach of like what you might do by default. That makes sense.
There's some different questions popping up, but let's start with by default. Is there such a thing as a by default?
Absolutely. Yeah.
How would you describe a by default approach?
Like, everyone's got their favorite plugins or gear or whatever that they reach for, and they're like aiming for, they're like, oh man, I really love this tape saturation, or I really love this limiter, or, I just love boosting high end. I'm just always going to boost high end. I mean, that's what I mean by like somebody sends me something like, oh, okay, a lot of stuff benefits from just maybe a tiny high end shelf, adding a little bit of presence or whatever. Especially if you're controlling the high end by using some high frequency limiting or something to like handle sibilants or harsh cymbals or whatever, and then you often will add a little bit back in to kind of, but that's something that you might do by default. Like, oh, I hear this thing, I'm just going to start doing the stuff I normally do. I'm not really paying attention.
What was the thing that you said to help control some of the high end stuff?
So people, essentially like, it's like basically de-essing the entire mix. Think of it as something that is like fairly common. You'll use a high frequency limiter.
And that's because we were all fucking it up pretty badly.
No, I mean, it's more just, some people are more sensitive to high end information than others. And it's also just that a lot of people can't hear it on their systems. They're like boosting all this high end because they're missing parts of it.
And in my situation, sometimes it's the opposite. It's like my Carl Tat system sounds so good that when I boost it, it just sounds like a fun, creative approach to it. And then later I hear it in the car, I'm like, what the hell was I thinking?
Yeah, but also to go back to your other question, which I kind of skipped, you can check it. You can check stuff on other systems. That's like one way to kind of go about how it translates. But kind of the best way to know how something translates is to have a flat response. That's like, it's shown that translates the best across all systems if you're listening on a flat system and making it sound as good as possible without any hype anywhere. It's like, on some systems it might sound a little bass heavy. On some systems it might sound brighter, but if you're listening on a system that has, maybe some hyped high end or something, it might feel kind of bright to you, but then on some other systems it might sound kind of dark as a result because you're hearing high end that's not actually there.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced that in both directions, like thinking I can brighten something in the studio and then taking it out to the car and going like, what the hell? Or vice versa, thinking it's bright enough and then listening somewhere else and being like, wow, this is really dark.
Well, and sometimes it's kind of not always, I feel like what I can hear in my studio is pretty flat and pretty accurate, maybe even very flat and very accurate. But it's, occasionally, if I just want to take a break from the studio and just get a feel of something else, I will go listen to something in the car. I don't do it for every project. It's not like a regular part of my process, but sometimes, and that's not like, I don't come back and make a ton of EQ changes as a result. Sometimes it's just like, okay, what does this feel like?
Right.
Or, maybe pop AirPods in, like, okay, what does this feel like I don't do that all the time. I'll usually listen on headphones and speakers in the studio, mostly just on speakers. And, but occasionally, it's like, you just kind of want to get, especially sometimes, I have certain clients that are like, they're all kind of, I want the vibe to be the certain way. And they're like, man, if you could work on this and then just go take a drive and listen to the record in your car, just, get it. And I'm like, all right, sure. I'll do that.
Yeah.
I could also tell them I did and not do it, but,
But if you're listening now, that didn't happen.
No, but sometimes it's kind of nice to get out and, feel like, okay, what if I'm going for a drive? How does this whole thing flow?
Yeah.
And then sometimes you might hear like, oh yeah, maybe I could add a little more excitement or maybe, whatever.
Yeah, I listen in the car all the time. So let's take that to the next part of playback and having a sense in the real world. So now you live in, like you probably spent years trying to figure out how to make things loud and pack it up into that, last few bits of maximum full scale deflection of the meters. And then along comes the, loudness matching and streaming services, and everything gets normalized according to the center level or whatever we want to call it, just like the general level of each track. So what kind of stuff related to that do you find to be important to be aware of? How do you master stuff so that it's appropriate for playing back on a Spotify or an Apple Music or Tidal or wherever?
Sure. And this is a good question because this is something that comes up all the time. Every week at least someone asks me about this. So loudness is an interesting thing because you have these quote unquote targets that streaming services will ask you to aim for, and then no one does that. So, there's this idea, which I'm sure pretty much everyone is familiar with, called best practices, which is where you look at, the people up at the top, like what are they doing? What's the top 1% of people doing? And so if you look at what people, you look at like the Taylor Swift records or any of the, high top 40, top of the Billboard charts records, like, okay, what are they doing? Is there stuff like super squashed and loud, or are they aiming for like the recommended Spotify level of -14 LUFS? It's like, no, they're not. It's, they're it's more like -8, -7. It's all pretty loud.
Now, where do you find this -8, -7 number? Maybe explain to us.
So if you were to,
what are we looking at?
An LUFS, for anyone who's not familiar, is loudness units full scale. And it basically is the loudness. It's the best way to measure loudness as the human ear hears it, as, so it takes the loudness over the course of the entire song. So it kind of factors in dynamics of the quiet parts of the song and the loud parts of the song. And then it gives you kind of an integrated number of what the whole song is as a whole.
Plus, it's also considering the peaks, like this kicks and snares that poke through and spike up and make those nice, pretty spikes on your audio file, right?
Yeah, usually not so many spikes once it's mastered. It just kind of looks like a brick wall. But it depends on the music, though, for sure. Yeah. A nice acoustic song, you can see those transients. That's great.
So the LUFS is that measurement of the general loudness
of the loudness, right? So, and so the recommended level for that is -14, that's fairly dynamic. And I think stuff sounds great around there.
And that's what you would create the music at, because you need to have if you're going to measure something. If I was building something in my wood shop, I'd need to have a ruler, or like a benchmark, literally.
Right.
It's like a mark on the bench, like each, piece of wood needs to be this long. And so you can go back and check against that. So in your studio, you can check against this -14 and shoot for that. And then you hand it off you upload it to DistroKid or wherever, and it's now playing back off these streaming services.
Yeah. And so the loudness normalization thing, there are a couple reasons why that's largely ignored / stuff just does get normalized is, one is, I think, like the density of the sound. If you can, without destroying the song, use compression and limiting and saturation and various tools to raise the loudness / perceived volume of the song, even if it gets turned down to match the stuff that's at -14 on some playback systems, it still has this like density that maybe the more dynamic stuff doesn't. And I'm not saying that's necessarily the better way, but I'm just saying I think that could be part of why people still aim for loudness. And I think the other thing is there are still some systems that don't normalize audio. And I think it's kind of the fear of your song being quieter than somebody else's song. And so it's like everyone else's songs are loud. So like, I got to make my song loud.
Yeah.
Because it's
a real thing. Because I've listened to, I comparatively listen, and you can tell, especially if you've been doing this for a while, you just hear something and you just instantly can tell that you've reached for the volume knob.
Yeah.
On something,
And
turn it
it's
up.
and it is also, normalization is a setting you can turn off on some listening, like on Spotify, for instance.
Yeah.
You can turn that off.
In the settings area, yeah.
Yeah, but about 90% of, the last time I looked into this, was like 90% of people have it on because it's on by default. And so you'd have to go in and turn it off. And you kind of have to be aware of that even existing to think about turning it off. But like I have mine turned off on my streaming services just so I can hear how loud things actually are if I want to check something, check a reference or whatever. But
so that's a good tip for us, Rockstars. If you're trying to understand how things compare before they were uploaded to streaming, you might go into the settings and turn it off and listen to some different records that way, or some different singles, and get a feel
and then
for it.
You will definitely hear the volume differences between things that way.
Yeah.
While if you have normalization on, you might still hear some slight volume differences just in the differences of like perceived loudness and, again, density of things that are going on. But it definitely won't be quite as drastic. Stuff will be much more, similar overall.
Right. Well, so maybe a way to imagine that is a dynamic mix. Those spikes and the levels shoot higher, and so that one might, that might compare to a very loud mix that then gets turned down. But maybe the loud mix, the body of the mix is still louder than the dynamic body was, or something, and therefore feels like it's still louder. But anyway, it's kind of irrelevant. I think in the end, well, I mean, it's all partly relevant, but in the end, I think we're all in pursuit of something that sounds great and sounds right to us when we're creating.
Totally.
And so you have to like understand what's going on with these things, but also just still trust your intuition on it, right?
Right. And it's not like, there are a lot of things that factor into loudness, and loudness being the end goal. I kind of have to talk people down from this sometimes, where like they just want to push their stuff louder and louder and louder. I'm like, okay, we can do that. That's fine. But at a certain point, some material starts to just deteriorate the louder you push it,
Right.
like some stuff can just, it only wants to go so far, and then it starts to sound bad because loudness comes just as much, if not more, from the mix than it does from mastering. Like I can add more volume, but if the mix is already really compressed and just kind of doesn't have a lot of life to it, the louder I make it, it's only going to sound worse after a certain point. It's like, like numbers wise, that song might be way louder than like top 40 stuff, but it still doesn't sound as loud because like it had all the life crushed out of it in the mix before we even got to it in mastering. And so sometimes there's only so far that something can go. And I think as long as it's, my thought with loudness is if it's in the realm of other stuff and it kind of hangs, it doesn't have to be exactly as loud. Like, if you're some indie band and you play your song next to like an Ariana Grande song, it's like, it doesn't need to be as loud as that. It's like, it just doesn't. As long as it's not 10 dB quieter, it's like there's some room for, no volume adjustment is ever going to sound as good as your volume knob, just turning it up and down. And I know that people are so anti, like, oh, I want everything. I don't want the people to ever have to touch the volume knob when they hear my song. It's like, okay, but think about your musical listening experience and how if you're in the car, you've got your own playlist of songs that I like on Spotify, whatever.
I am super impressed with iZotope Ozone. I've been mastering many of my records recently, and Ozone makes it so easy to get a fantastic sound. The built-in mastering assistant helps by measuring the mix and suggesting all the settings needed for a professionally mastered result, based on the genre and EQ curve of your choice. You can even reference a specific song if you want. Using simple yet sophisticated modules like Clarity, Impact, Low-End Focus, Stabilizer, Imager, Exciter, and Spectral Shaping, along with powerful dynamic EQ, compression, and limiting, you simply adjust the settings to your own taste and it sounds incredible. And the magic of master rebalance means that you can reach into your mix at the mastering stage and manipulate the vocal, bass, and drums. Amazing. My bandmates are pretty demanding of my mixes, but now when I send off the masters for approval, the band absolutely loves the way our records sound thanks to iZotope and Ozone. Use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off Ozone or other tools like RX and Voice Enhancement Assistant, or grab any of the cool free plugins like the new Trash Light over at iZotope.com. What do songwriters, music producers, DJs, EDM, TV, and film composers all have in common with you and me? We all crave captivating sounds that elevate our music to the next level. That's why Native Instruments is your ultimate creative companion, offering a vast library of sounds for your studio. Whether you're crafting hip-hop beats, indie pop melodies, classic rock anthems, serene meditation tracks, pulsating dance floor hits, or intricate orchestral compositions, Native Instruments' complete bundle has you covered. From drums, loops, and beats to dynamic synths, lifelike strings, and vintage instruments like electric bass, guitars, and keys. The possibilities are endless. Use the coupon code ROCK10 for 10% off, or download the free gifts waiting for you, like the awesome new Jacob Collier Audience Choir and Complete Start featuring 2,000 sounds and 6 gigs of samples over at nativeinstruments.com. Hey, Rockstars, we're back now for the jam session. My guest today is Joe Hutchinson, joining us here at RSR454. Joe, you ready to kick it off, jam?
Oh, yeah.
Whatever that means. I still don't know what any of this means, but you got to have a name for stuff, right? If you're going to do a podcast.
Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned was automation, I think you said, when you were talking about, didn't have time for it at Bonnaroo. What is automation and how is that a part of mastering? What is that?
So, it can be a number of things. Sometimes it can just be volume automation, sometimes with, if you have a mix that's pretty compressed or whatever, the verse comes along and the vocal's just right here in your face. And then it hits the chorus and it almost sounds like it's like, where'd everything go? Because the compression is kicked in and it almost just like ducks the vocal.
Right, like everything just goes back into the mix.
And so in those instances, I'll just bring down the overall volume of the verses so that and again, when stuff's this compressed and it's already hitting zero, so I can't boost the chorus necessarily. I mean, I could, automate the threshold of a limiter. You could do it that way. It's just kind of two different ways of doing the same thing, but I'll often do a little bit of volume automation to kind of make that difference not so stark. That's one thing. The other thing can be you can even automate like EQ moves or something if you want to. If there's a section that you feel like could use a little bit of high end, but you don't want to add high end to the whole song.
Yeah.
Similar ways that you'd automate stuff in a mix. I don't go crazy with it, but it just depends on what it needs.
So, I can understand doing it in a mix. Doing it on the master makes me want to ask some questions about how to do that. So I know that in the past, one of the tools you used was Studio One for mastering. Is that still something you use for mastering? I do
still use Studio One. Yeah.
Because that's what I've been using too. And I'm always calling Rockstars every time I'm doing something. I'm like, Joe, how do you do this one thing? I'll text him. Yeah, but then I'll hear back like the next day and I'm like, I already figured something out.
Sorry. I'm slow to respond.
Not your fault.
Sometimes.
It's just that's how we all are, right?
Yeah.
Like you want the answer right then and there. So where would you have access to a volume automation move in Studio One? So, and at Rockstars, if you haven't used Studio One, it's from PreSonus. They have a project area of using it where you can assemble all these mixes together and essentially master a record.
Mm-hmm. Two ways. If you have an older version of Studio One, you'd have to do it in the song portion, which is kind of the mix, the mix or recording side of Studio One. But starting at version 4 or 5, they added volume automation to the project view, which is like the mastering thing. So you can automate parameters of plugins, you can automate volume, whatever. So you can just do that.
So where do you find that? So I haven't used that yet. So the way to picture this is in that project view, over on the left-hand column, you have sort of a list of the names of songs. If you select one of the songs, then there's a list of plugins that will follow each song. there's different areas for the plugins. There's the insert plugins that are a collection of plugins you put on that one song. Then there's the master post fader or pre-fader, where you can put a bunch of plugins that are just on the output. So every song that plays goes through them. And then there's another section that's like monitoring or something, or just post fader, I guess, where you could put like metering plugins, I guess, and things like that, maybe there's stuff that isn't going to even process the audio, but it's just going to give you insights into things. And then down on the bottom, you have these 2 lanes of audio, of mixes. So you have like, it almost looks like track 1 and 2. And then, song 1 is, if I'm describing this, I'm picturing it in my head. So stop me if I'm describing it wrong.
Yeah.
But, like track 1 is like the first song, and then track 2 is the second song, and it butts right up against track 1, right?
Yeah.
Am I saying that right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's the automation and all those parameters are down in that kind of where you see the waveforms of the songs. There you have a few different options. It's now that I don't have it in front of me, I can't tell you. It's either right above or just to the left of the waveforms. You have automation options.
And in the same way that you could have a volume line across your track in Pro Tools, you can have a volume line. Does it run across the whole lane in Studio One, or is it like per song?
It's per song.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also I do sometimes do stuff in Pro Tools still, because if I have to make edits to something, like I often will still record in Pro Tools. Like if I'm recording something through tape, I usually do that in Pro Tools. And then sometimes if I want to make some edits or do some automation there, I will sometimes do that as well, and then bring it into the project view of Studio One.
Yeah, I mean, I learned Pro Tools first. That's still my main thing. So all the, like learning how to ride a bike or something. It's like if I think about editing, I think about what Pro Tools does for editing, and it is pretty great for that. And I'm sure you could do a lot of those things in PreSonus in the DAW area or the song area, but if you're in the project area, maybe it's a little tricky.
I mean, you have, you don't have maybe everything that you could do in Pro Tools, but you have at least volume and like EQ parameter automation, plug-in parameter automation, which is usually enough. And I generally in a song, I'm not really doing any or much at all. Primarily, I'm just processing the entire song. It's only if it feels like the song needs some changes in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's cool. And I haven't really messed with that. I've even heard people talk about doing a trick where maybe the verse starts out strong and then it slowly descends 1 dB by the end of the next the verse before it hits the next chorus, so that you just get that 1 dB lift again.
Yeah, that's cool.
You just don't even notice it or something.
That if I am doing volume automation, I'm usually doing it kind of gradually as opposed to big jumps, unless you want a big jump up for the chorus or whatever.
And then if I think about ways to do that in Pro Tools, I might think you can have a volume line and then just go in and, put breakpoints on it and make adjustments from moment to moment. And then, that raises questions like, is it like a brick wall cliff falling off a cliff where the volume adjustment is, or is it a very, very fast, pulling, a move where the fader's coming down across a beat or two, kind of thing. Like if you zoomed in, would you see an angle on that volume line, or would it just look like a brick
usually,
wall?
I don't usually do the straight up or down. I usually have even if it's a really steep angle, I usually kind of do it that way. But I mean, it all just depends on what you're trying to
depends on
what
the
you're trying to do
and stuff like that. And then if I think about another way to do it, I might think about in Pro Tools, you could chop the mix up at these points that you want different volume, and then you could just do a little bit of clip gain there.
Clip gain, yeah.
And then sort of crossfade them or not crossfade them depending on how it sounds.
Yeah.
But I don't think you can do that inside PreSonus in the project.
You can. Right? It's just really clunky looking, so I never do it.
Does it like bump it onto the other track?
You can split parts of a track without creating a new track.
Okay.
And then adjust. And you do have, quote unquote clip gain, per song. So you could do it that way. It just looks really clunky because it kind of shifts. You're kind of looking at the dual lane thing.
So it puts it, you're on lane 1, but now your edit is on lane 2 and then back to lane 1.
Again,
that would drive me bananas.
It's clunky looking. I don't like it. So I never use that feature.
Okay, cool. So that's cool to know that is a thing worth doing. So places that you would think about this level automation are the verse, maybe because the voice was so loud because of the way it was mixed and compressed, and the voice just felt too loud.
Right.
Or that you want to add more impact when the chorus hits. Are there any other spots where do you sometimes just need to adjust? Do you even go in and adjust vocal levels for a phrase in a certain section? Or
no, I mean, that's almost always done in the mix. And if it's not, you can usually tame that with like a compressor or something. So I won't go in and, do that fine tuning of automation, but I'll just use a compressor for that kind of stuff.
Right.
If like a certain vocal phrase pops out. Yeah.
I'm sure part of the answer for you is like you'll do anything that's needed on something, but not everything's needed on every project.
Right.
And or sometimes you have to wait until like it's absolutely clear that something's needed in a certain spot.
Right,
and then
right.
you look at it. Otherwise you'd be, as we know with this stuff, it's like you could spend forever trying to finish your record or you could get it done. And when we look for ways to do things when it's not even, when we don't, before we actually need to do it.
Right.
We're just wasting time too.
Yeah.
Do you use Isotope and Ozone and tools like that?
I use a lot of Isotope plugins. I think I use RX quite a bit because there's a lot of things I think that either people aren't sensitive to them or they can't hear them. And things like mouth noises or big guitar squeaks or, pops from bad edits where they didn't put a crossfade somewhere or whatever. And you can fix a lot of that stuff, even in a stereo mix or a master, using RX. It's, it can be a little tedious if you have to fix a ton of them. But to me, that always makes the finished product sound cleaner. And so I'm always going to do it. If I hear a bunch of pops or something, I'm usually going to fix them.
Okay. So how does that integrate in your workflow? Studio One, I know if I've used RX with Pro Tools, there are features that it will sort of like export a file over to RX and bring it back into Pro Tools. Some of those can get a little bit complicated when you want to hook it up and hear it all in real time inside the mix versus other ways.
I will just, if I notice that a song has a bunch of pops or whatever, I'll just stop working on it and I just pull the song into RX and I do all the edits and then I go back to actually mastering it.
Now, how do you go back into Studio One? Because I do remember that was a little bit of a trick where it's like to swap a file out and be right back where you left off. It was a little bit tricky in PreSonus.
You used to have to do some, weird workaround where you move the file into a different folder and then tell it that the file it's looking for is this new one. That's what I used to do, which is dumb, but that was the workaround. Now you can literally just right click on the waveform and say, use this file instead, and just tell it which file to use.
Okay,
so
cool.
That's kind of the easy way to replace it.
How would you send it over to RX? Would you go into the audio files folder and you just know what the correct one was you were working on?
I just open the standalone RX, and you can just literally drag and drop a mix in there. And then when I'm done,
but not from PreSonus.
No. From like
from a Finder
I'm using a Mac, so like from a Finder window, I just drag and drop the mix in. When I'm done, I export it back to the same place, and then
you go into PreSonus, right click on it, and say use this
one instead.
And do you have a naming? Do you have a way that you name the new fixed file?
I'll just put like fix or pop fix or automation or whatever it is that I've done, just to denote that it's something.
3,472.
Ideally, I only do it once, but then somebody's like, "Oh man, I heard something in the mix. I want to send you a new one." And you're like, "God," like cool. I guess I'll spend another hour doing that. But usually I only have to do it one time.
Oh, when you say they heard something in the mix, you mean they send you a new mix?
Oh yeah, sorry, that's what I meant for.
Yeah, I've ran into that working with John Baldrich the first time. He pointed out that in sending a new mix, you have to redo that whole process in RX. It's too bad that you can't like fool RX into thinking
I
about
know.
that other file.
I feel like maybe that's something, with AI and stuff in the future. Maybe that's something you can go, hey, look at these two songs, see how they're almost the same. Do everything that I did on this song to this song.
One of these things is just like the other.
That would be really great. That would be really great.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So then you can bring it back into your session. You just cleaned up some stuff in RX. What about Ozone? Is that one of the tools you use at all?
Yeah, I use certain modules from Ozone. I like the maximizer, the Ozone limiter. That's cool. And I do like I use the Ozone EQ sometimes, and the dynamic EQ from Ozone I use quite a bit. I use some Ozone stuff. I like Ozone.
Have you used rebalance yet?
I have. It's kind of hard sometimes to use it and make it sound natural, but I've gotten away with it a few times, like subtly. If like the vocal's really buried, sometimes you can use rebalance to like, let's bring the vocal up a little, and then
what was the example when you looked at it and you're like, it didn't sound natural?
Well,
were you trying to like completely remove everything or something?
Well, you just can't really do that. I mean, you can. There's just sometimes you're sort of weighing the balance of like, okay, maybe the vocal's too quiet. I want to bring it up. I can't get a new mix for whatever reason, so I'm trying to do it using these. I mean, Isotope has all the. I don't know how they do it. It's like black magic to me. How they can remove noises and rebalance things. The mix, like that's kind of wild. And you can usually do it a little bit without it really being audible. But sometimes if you're doing it, if you're trying to get several more dB out of the vocal, it's like it's trying to pull the vocal out of the song that has lots of stuff going on. So it's inevitably going to grab some little artifacts from somewhere, or something's going to start to sound a little weird with the high end or whatever. I'm sure someone will disagree with me and go, no, it always sounds natural. It's like, I don't know. I'm usually pretty cautious with that kind of stuff. I will sometimes use it a little bit.
You probably have to be like conservative by nature, and that's why everybody's like, that's kind of what we want out of our mastering engineer.
Right. I mean, you don't want, unless something sucks, you don't want to change it completely.
Yeah.
And sometimes something does suck and they're like, I'll sometimes work with some young artists that do everything themselves. And by that, I mean, they produce, record, and mix and edit all their own stuff. And they've probably heard the song 500 times. By the time they send it to me, they don't even know what's what anymore. They're just like, hey, here's a mix. What do you think?
Right.
And, sometimes I'll even send them some notes of like, hey, you could try maybe a couple things that I think would help.
They probably love that too.
Yeah. And I think that can definitely be part of the process, is because you're hearing things with a fresh perspective. Giving people feedback when necessary, because you can't do everything in mastering. There's some stuff that does have to be handled in the mix. And
that also reminds me of especially for the, people who are DIY, who are doing they're the artists, but they're also recording themselves and mixing themselves. And they might have friends and people that they might play some music with, but they're not necessarily part of a band. And then it's like, who do you turn to just get excited about the process of making a record? So like that must be a little bit of your role sometimes, is you're the excitement factor. I mean, I remember I used to go take records to Jim DeMaine early on over at Yes Master when I was first making records. And it was just all I wanted him to do was just like me a lot, just like me, like this record.
That's what we all want, Lidge.
Right.
Just like me.
But do you notice that? Do you notice that like part of your role is to just be this like, cheering, a cheerleader for the part of the cheer team for the artist in the band?
Yeah, I think so. I think people definitely appreciate it when you're, anytime you're complimentary. I try not to give, empty compliments. Like if I don't like something, I'm not going to go on and on about how great it is.
Right.
But if I do like something, I always let them know, because I think it's important to, encourage the people that are making good art to keep doing it.
Yeah.
Even if it's, some guy that works at a coffee shop and, none of his songs have more than 1,000 streams on Spotify, but it's like, I think it's killer. I'm going to tell him every time, like, man, this music rules. This is so good. Please keep doing it, know, because it's not all about, making it big and doing it's just a hobby for some people. And then like, it's fine. It can stay a hobby. But yeah, anyway.
No, it reminds me of a time I was working with the band The Living Things, and I think it was the vinyl EP we did, and we sent it to Bob Ludwig at Gateway Mastering, and he mastered it. And when it came back with a letter from him, and he was like, and he wrote this letter. I was just saying, like, this is really great stuff. I really think you guys are going to do fabulously well, and all this. And it was it seemed so genuine. I was like, I felt like we just got a letter from Santa Claus, saying like we were on the good list.
No, that's killer. Well, something that people have said to me is, especially like a younger artist that works on something, and I send him the masters, and then I usually will kind of write some notes in the email with the link, like, hey man, this is really great. Like, I love this song. Like, this is such a cool thing. Sometimes those younger artists will be like, man, I love, it means a lot that you love it because you listen to so much music. And I think maybe that's part of that. It's like, I'll hear hundreds and hundreds of songs every year. And so I think people do appreciate when you give them a compliment, because they're like, okay, you hear a lot of music. You're probably not going to tell me you like this if you think it sucks, because you have heard, who knows how many hundred songs this year. And probably a lot of them have been great, but so they're kind of comparing themselves against like all the other stuff that you've heard and worked on. So
and what is great and what sucks anyway.
It's all, you're right.
There's elements of different records that I feel like you can find something really, a strength in everything,
You're right. There's so much opinion in it. It kind of, you definitely try to be objective in a lot of ways as mastering engineer, but I think there is even if some people would say it's small, there is a creative aspect to it that is you kind of adding a little bit of your opinion of how it should sound to the music.
Yeah. In 2024, Adam Audio will celebrate 25 years of researching, developing, and manufacturing industry-leading monitoring solutions in Berlin. To mark this milestone, our friends at Adam Audio are unveiling a very special limited edition series of monitors that will look gorgeous in your studio and sound as awesome as your music. Introducing the Arctic White A4V and A7V series, available for a limited time to pro and home studio owners like yourself. The clean, glossy white finish exudes a decadent feel and will stand out in any studio or in-home audio system. Featuring the XART accelerated ribbon tweeter design and customizable speaker voicings, the Arctic White A4V and A7V have the full specifications of the original design. Plus, with SonarWorks integration for automated room correction, you can fine-tune your monitors to your control room's acoustics. Plus, with SonarWorks integration for automated room correction, you can fine-tune your monitors to your control room's acoustics. Adam Audio's commitment to delivering professional-grade, high-fidelity sound to studios worldwide has made these monitors a perfect fit for Grammy-winning producers in both pro and home studios for a quarter of a century. Now you can bring that beautiful high-fidelity sound to your own productions and make your studio look as amazing as your music. Don't miss out on the new limited edition Arctic White A4V and A7V monitors, available for a short time with an extended 5-year warranty at adamaudio.com. So there was another Bob Ludwig story I remember hearing, and your intro talked about sometimes it's heavy-handed and sometimes you're trying to be transparent. I don't remember what it was or who told it, but there was some story about like a song going to Gateway, and Bob's response was, this is perfect, and did nothing.
I've heard that story too.
Which is a fascinating story. And along with it was the implication that like it was still worth sending it to mastering because you wanted that final opinion on it too as well. You wanted the ears on it, not just the EQ or whatever.
Totally. Yeah. And I think I try to, I try to handle things that way, where if something sounds truly just magnificent to me, I'm like, man, I'm going to do as little as possible to this. Maybe it needs like a 1 dB bump in volume, but like it's not getting any EQ. I'm going to try to make that 1 dB bump as transparent as I can because it sounds so great. Sometimes you do just stay out of the way and go, hey man, you really nailed this, or whoever worked on it. It's like, hey, you you really did a great job. And I'm just telling you did a great job. And that's most of what I'm doing here.
How do you know when you need to do something and what you should do next? Like, so for example, one of the processes I went through recently was really learning how to use Ozone and using the mastering assistant feature and everything, which I'm sure a lot of people appreciate, that there are tools out there that will help them do something that they don't, they feel like they're a beginner at or whatever. So I used it and I was like, this is so cool that it like comes up with all this stuff. But I also scratched my head and I'm like, well, what's it thinking?
Right.
It's coming up with these decisions. What's driving those decisions, and do I agree with those and stuff like that? So I'm just curious about that. And it, for me, in the end, it was like really cool to have it suggest some things, but then the end result was I backed it all way off, kind of thing.
And I think that's probably, I think that's probably the best way to handle that sort of thing. I think all of that kind of stuff, and as AI becomes more and more a thing, all this kind of smart EQ processing, whatever. It's like if you feed Ozone a stereo mix and you say, hey, what do you think I should do to this? It's going to be like, oh, cut these spots EQ wise, put a little dynamic EQ here. Let's expand some low end. And, so you can kind of zoom out and look at all like, okay, that's what it suggested. It parts of what it did I like, and then parts of it kind of lost some of its sparkle, right. So like maybe I take a few of these ideas and just dial them way back or do them manually or whatever. It can kind of just be like a learning tool to a degree. And yeah, you're right. Like
great learning tool.
What is it based on, what it's doing? And like, I don't know. It's probably just fed tons and tons and tons of music that sounds good.
And then you've got this whole thing of like, and I'm saying all this in the context of, I think Isotope and Ozone are freaking amazing. So don't mishear me, rock stars. But it's important to understand what's going on with these things so that you can use all these tools the best way. And like it's still like picking genres. It's like, this is rock. I'm like, well, what the hell is rock? How do you even like decide that?
Yeah.
So I think it's good to know those things. I think that you said something that was really helpful. So like if you're using a tool like that, some things to consider are, if you recorded and mixed it yourself and now you're mastering it, you're probably listening in the same space on the same speakers too. So maybe that's what makes it challenging to figure out what to do next sometimes, because you're like, you already made all these decisions and now you got to make more decisions with the same perspective. So working with a mastering engineer like yourself, you're this whole new perspective in a whole new environment. So that can be really valuable. But it occurs to me that an AI assistant is going to, like, of course it's going to suggest using all the modules that we just built in this thing. Yeah. So I think a good reminder is like, try it out. And then the first thing I would do is turn every move off and then just turn them on one at a time and listen. Like, okay, what does this move do? Okay, it made this EQ curve, turn it on, turn it off. How does that sound? And then it's got these sliders where you can do more or less of it. So it's pretty cool stuff.
It is. It's very cool.
So let's see. So, and I did use the rebalance plugin. I found that really helpful because I had, let's just say I wasn't going to go back and fuck with my mixes anymore at that point. Yeah. So like, if I just wanted a little more punch out of drums or bass or vocal, vocal feels too loud, too quiet. It was nice to just like adjust it slightly.
I mean, I think it's so cool that stuff exists. And I have used that. The newest version of Ozone actually it kind of takes that a step further where you can say, okay, I want to maybe turn up or down the vocals and I want to compress just the vocals, but not the whole mix. And it lets you go kind of deep, which is pretty wild. I haven't dug into it a ton yet, but it's that's pretty cool. If you're able to kind of get that deep inside of something and still make it sound good. It's pretty cool that you're able
I think
to do
that stuff's great. And I didn't explore that yet. I don't think either. I think what I did is I'd put a module on, I'd put a rebalance module and just click it on bass and then say, more or less of the bass. And I guess if I had just added some plugins some modules after that, it would have been affecting just the bass with those modules. Maybe that's how that works. I don't remember.
I mean, again, I haven't
Cool
really
that
dug into it a
exists.
ton. I just know that it exists now.
So you could EQ the bass a little further or EQ the vocal a little further, even though it's inside the track.
Yeah, I think you have to like make a separate instance of whatever part of Ozone that is, and you're essentially quote unquote soloing that thing.
Right.
And but you're not actually. You're just soloing the process on that thing.
Right.
It's pretty cool though.
Very cool feature. All right. So then what are some other fun tools that you might turn to in your mastering? I guess, if you got analog stuff, that's fine. But obviously, the Rockstars have mostly have access to plugins and things like that. So it's always exciting to hear about stuff that's worth checking out.
Plugin wise, some stuff that's cool. There's everyone uses like the FabFilter Pro L2 in addition to like the Ozone limiter. There are a couple like multi-band limiters that I like that are cool. Newfangled Audio, I think it's Elevate is the one that's, I should know. I just remember it's Newfangled Audio.
I think those all come from Eventide now.
Yeah, that's a cool like multi-band one. DMG Audio makes a plugin called Limitless, which is also really cool. Kind of two-stage multi-band limiter. And I mean, there's like there's a lot of good stuff out there. I'm bringing up limiters a lot because that's sort of what I end up using very often.
Right, because most of the time we're
as far as in the box goes. And and then there's some cool vibe plugins. There's the Oxford Inflator. I know you're familiar with that one. That's a cool one, which definitely can sound pretty weird if you use too much of it, but can sound very cool if you blend in. I'll often use that, and I just blend in, I don't know, 5%, 7% of and kind of find a way to it just adds just a little bit of vibe, because
what kind of source material might be the most friendly to Oxford Inflator? Acousticy things with like...
I mean, on almost everything, because it's basically...
Like even on a big rock track?
Yeah, totally. It's a wave shaper, and so it kind of works like a... It's sort of like saturation in a way, but it's like adding... It's almost like it's adding expansion or some kind of parallel processing to the whole thing. And so it just... The more you turn it up, the more you hear everything, like the average level come up, and it does kind of add a little bit of vibe to it as well.
Yeah.
But again, if you do it too much, your low end can start to sound less tight for sure if you add too much of that. So it seems to inflate the middle of the frequencies. Yeah, maybe the most. But I mean, it adds high end, it adds low end, it kind of adds everything. There is probably a little bit of a curve to it, but that's kind of a cool one that you can. And you can even stack those. You can use like a couple instances. That's a cool little trick.
I haven't tried that.
You can use a few, and if you've got one on and it's at like 8%, you can put another one on at like 7%. And you're just blending them in.
Better than one at 15%.
I think so. But and that's kind of the same idea of like that is very common in mastering. I do it all the time. You stack compressors, limiters, clippers, whatever kind of vibe you're going for. As opposed to you could have one limiter that's doing 4 dB of gain reduction, or you could have two limiters that are each doing 2 dB, or you could have three limiters, one's doing 2 dB, the next two are doing 1 dB of gain reduction. And to me, the most natural sounding would be one limiter doing 2 dB and then two other limiters doing 1 dB, because they're all reacting a little bit differently, and you're not going to hear necessarily the audible like pumping or crunching of one limiter being pushed too far. And then you do the same thing with compression, where it's just like doing a third of a dB, half a dB, and you just like stack a few of those on there.
It does make sense if you think about it for a sec. So while we might think one limiter, why does three limiters doing 2, 1, and 1 limiting sound different than one limiter doing 4 dB of limiting? I think it's good to remember that each plugin is responding to the material that is fed into it. So the original mix is hitting, or whatever's going into that limiter that's doing 4 dB is shaped a certain way, and now it's responding to that and it's making a move. Whereas if you do it and it comes in and it's doing 2 dB and it spits something out. Now you have this new source audio that's going into the next one and it's responding to that instead. So it really is different. They're different things.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not just like a quirk of digital or some.
No,
some
it
idea like
sounds, it sounds very different. And all limiters, really most plugins and the way they react, especially dynamics processing, they do have a sound, so certain ones will sound, and almost all modern day limiters are program dependent, meaning they, they're very fast attack wise, and then the release will vary based on the material. So if there's a lot of sustained low end, like a big bass note, it's going to release slower over time. And if it's just a snare hit, it'll release almost instantly because all it's doing is grabbing that transient and then it's coming back up. And so like limiters are kind of, they're smart, they sort of do the work for you. They're kind of
what
cool
are
these
some
days.
of the different kinds of limiters? You mentioned a clipper too.
Oh, yeah. So
how do we think about if it's an introduction to limiting? Are there like a couple of different variations or a few different variations to be aware of?
Of limiters? Yeah, I mean, there are quite a few. And then clipping is just, it's like limiting, but
With
taking
the distortion pedal?
taking a step further. It's like you're putting the ceiling there, and all it is like, think of it as like instant attack and instant release, but the ceiling is like it's going nowhere. And so it can sometimes be cool for like really sharp, quick transients, like a snare or something. Can sometimes sound cool hitting a clipper because it doesn't really sound like it's doing anything. And it's so fast that you don't even sometimes hear the distortion. But then it will sound very bad if you feed it like a ton of, typically anyway, if you feed it like a ton of sustained low end, while like a limiter that kind of is going to react to the material will sound much more natural because it won't distort when you feed it a bunch of stuff. So, I mean, yeah, and there are a lot of different limiters and types of limiters that you can use. Most plugin limiters these days, at a certain level anyway, work in a similar way. Well, like I was saying, they're just kind of program dependent. Like the FabFilter Pro L2 is probably the best example because it's one of the most commonly used limiters to add loudness. Lots of people do it in the mixing stage to kind of make their mixes like more competitively loud when they're sending it to a client. And sometimes it sounds great and they leave it on, and sometimes they'll turn that off before they send it to mastering or whatever. But like that's a really great sounding limiter that can go, you can push that pretty far and it usually sounds pretty okay. And yeah, I end up using that one a lot. But there's a lot of different ways you can
I
go.
remember for a long time it was the Waves L1 and L2. Those were the ones.
I remember.
And I don't know if I don't use them anymore.
I don't use them at all.
Yeah.
I remember using them starting out and thinking like, okay, this is kind of cool, but like if you're trying to like handle a kick drum that's loud in the mix, it sounds pretty like pumpy to me if you like feed it too much. But
right. So you've got limiter. So right now we're thinking of a limiter or a clipper. Is there another alternative that I should ask about or not?
I mean,
I don't know what that would be. I guess there's soft limiting.
There's
Maybe
like,
that's just different
compressing or soft clipping is another thing you could do,
right.
Which is I would say that's kind of similar to compression with a low ratio. It's where like what people will do which is just a way to kind of raise the average level without it being as noticeable. Like with a compressor with a low ratio or with a soft clipper, what you're doing is like way, way, way before the peak. Like you're starting the process, maybe 9 dB below the peak, and you're just very gradually like rounding it just a little bit. And so it's not, you can get away with, especially if you're only doing half a dB of that or whatever, it's like, it's not really audible.
And then limiters have, do they have attacks and releases on them usually or no?
They do. But
how often should we touch that knob?
Well, it depends on what you're using. So if you're using, I'm going to keep coming back to the Pro L2 by FabFilter just because it's a common example and most people are familiar with it. It has attack and release settings, but those only apply so much. it primarily is just reacting to what you're sending it. The different, but I mean, those do make a difference, but they, you could twist those knobs any way you want, and it's like it's not going to sound as wildly different as you think it will because it's primarily program dependent as a plugin. And but yeah, I mean, you can definitely put that. And then other limiters are fully just all they do is what you tell them to do. You set an attack and release time, and that just is what it is. And that's fine, but I think for a lot of applications, the whole like program dependent thing that's like in most modern limiters is more useful because it reacts to what's happening and then kind of gives you less chances to have distortion happen or audible pumping or something like that you're usually
trust your limiter.
They're usually trying to avoid. I mean, yeah, to a degree.
Well, let's talk about this. So let's say we're wanting to explore these things, and let's say we've got a few different ones. I mean, I've got like the FGX one from Slate. I've got clippers from T-Rex or T-Rex, excuse me, Ozone, Newfangled Audio, just a variety,
Yeah.
And then you end up with all this stuff and you're like, which one do I use or how do I use them? Is it worth sort of like putting them all on across something and then just flipping them on and off to see if they sound, you hear a sound in them or, and then the other part to this question is, let's say you narrowed it down. Let's say you're like, okay, I got the Pro L2 and a clipper. What order would you find them useful? Does clipping go first because you're just trying to shave off these kicks and snare peaks before the next thing?
A lot of the time people do, I'll answer your second question first. A lot of the time people do think of it that way of like they'll clip before a limiter because it sort of makes the limiter's life easier in a way. And then some people think of it the other way. They're like, oh, I've done my limiting. Now I want to use an even harder, just like cutoff kind of thing. So I think you can do it either way. I'll give you the boring answer for whatever sounds best is the right way to do it.
Yeah.
And then, what was your first question?
Let's stick to that for a sec. So the whatever sounds best. What are some ways that will help us teach ourselves how to know if it's what sounds best? Because sometimes we do things and we're just like, I don't know.
Your first question was ABCing limiters. Yeah, or figuring out which one to use. That's a totally valid way to do it. And I do that pretty often. If I'm kind of near the end of a song and I just want to add, an extra couple dB with a limiter, I'll often audition 3 or 4 plugins of, like, okay, we're just kind of trying to add a little volume here. Which one is the least offensive?
And do you sort of try and level match them too?
Yeah. Oh, you definitely level match them. So like they're all adding 2 dB or 1 dB or whatever it is. And then you turn one off or turn one on, turn it off, turn the next one on, turn it off, turn the next one on, turn it off, and kind of, okay, and often I'll listen to the same, maybe I'm listening to a chorus and I'll play half the chorus, turn that one off, go back to the beginning of the chorus, turn the next one on, play that one. And, so you're kind of listening to how it's reacting to the same section of music. And then, you usually will kind of be able to tell how they're each affecting the music and how they're reacting. And often it's like, you do that a couple times, then you land on, okay, this one seems to be like, option A is distorting, so we're not going to go with that. Option B is like, sounds pretty clean. Option C is kind of pumpy, so like B's the one, So, I mean, that's my process, and I think that often can be helpful.
What about speaker volume? Do you find that these kind of A/B considerations are more accurate, or you can tell what's going on better at a low level of listening or louder stuff, or does it just, again, depend on what you're looking for?
I think finding a comfortable volume that's not too loud, typically, if you have any sort of like way to monitor how loud you're listening, you can even get like apps on your phone that are definitely not entirely accurate, but they give you a ballpark idea.
You mean just SPL?
Yeah, just like SPL wise or something.
Yeah, so Rockstars, if you're curious about that, meter. You can get an app. I don't remember which ones I use, but they're probably just called SPL. Actually, there's probably one called SPL, and you just download it on your phone. It'll use the phone mic, and you can just set it on your desk while you're working, and it'll tell you what the sound pressure level is coming from the speakers acoustically in the space.
Yeah, and there are probably some that are pretty accurate,
Yeah,
but
because I mean they're
judging.
They don't have to be full range. They're mostly focusing on mid range.
And I think the recommended idea is that you stay under 85, maybe even preferably under 80 dB if you're listening for a long period of time. But you can listen to something, if you're in a quiet enough studio, you can listen to something at 80 dB and it still have plenty of, energy, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So I think one thing is just not listening too loudly because you'll wear your ears out. And then the other thing is listening at low volume can be quite useful for if you just want to reset. Because sometimes if you're listening, pretty loudly and everything, it's all sounding great, but you might be missing something that's happening. Like your ears are always going to like the thing that's louder. That's part of why people like, squashing things and loud mixes and masters these days, is because your ears always, even if it's louder to the point of like, this kind of hurts my ears, you're still going to be like, oh, that one's, if you A/B something and one's 1 dB louder than the other, every single person is going to go, I like the one that's louder better, just because you can hear everything more. And so that's kind of a, you gotta be careful that you're not just enjoying something because it's loud. And so checking stuff at a low volume, I think, is very important, because I can often listen at, like the quietest my speakers can play, and I'll be able to tell like, oh, on this last chorus, it is starting to crunch a little bit. I gotta back off something somewhere or whatever. And it's like, that's not always as audible if you're listening loudly. It's like, once I turn it back up, like, okay, now I can hear it, but I wasn't as honed in on that until I listened at a low volume.
Right. I've heard people say that it's easier to hear distortion and things at lower volumes.
I think it is.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think that we are distracted by all this energy of the low end and everything. And so there's the Fletcher-Munson curve, which basically says that at low volumes, we hear mid-range, and when you turn the volume up, we hear more bass and more treble. And it's probably an acoustical effect that's happening in our ear canal and everything. Like, we literally do hear more bass and treble, but it's probably also a mental effect that our brain focuses in on those other things more. So that makes sense that at the louder volume, when our brain is focused, is occupied with bass and treble now and how cranking our rock mix sounds, we might like not be paying attention to this other detail that needs attention, needs fixing.
Right.
And so turning it down helps us hear that. That's very cool. Do you have any other thoughts on your monitoring process? Do you have multiple speakers that you'll flip to, or do you just really learn to trust your flat main reference?
I don't have other speakers.
And what about the iPhone speaker? How relevant is that a finished thing needs to do, the correct playback?
Well, I certainly don't ever check something on an iPhone speaker. I mean, almost everything, if your iPhone speaker is all the way up, almost everything these days will sound at least kind of distorted on an iPhone speaker.
Good to hear, though.
Like literally everything. Like any, even dialogue on a YouTube video sounds a little crunchy until you turn it down a little bit, to me. So like it all just doesn't sound great on an iPhone speaker. So I personally don't think you should keep that in mind always. Some people do. Some people do kind of aim to like make sure that area of the mid-range and high mid-range is like just right, so that it feels right on an iPhone
your
speaker.
Playlist is playing back pretty great on an iPhone speaker.
Well, thanks.
I was flipping through, so.
And that goes back to my, it's not my theory, but the thing that I believe that if you can make it sound good in the flattest environment possible, it will translate best to the most listening systems.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of how I think of it.
Do you ever feel like the time that you've spent watching YouTube videos, trying out mix tricks, and tweaking version after version of your mixes has gotten you nowhere? Have you been looking for a simple, straightforward, step-by-step process for creating a pro mix that won't take you years to learn? What if you could have a Grammy-winning mix engineer who understood all your mixing struggles and could coach you through them? If you struggle with any of these questions, then the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass is just just for you. Now you can discover the proven step-by-step mix system from Grammy-winning mixer Craig Alvin for consistently creating a pro-quality mix from your home studio that will sound amazing everywhere. Listen to this quote from one of our students, David. Quote, "Absolutely the most informative and helpful block of information and mentoring on the mix process that I've ever been a part of. That was like sitting behind a mix engineer for years, watching and picking up tips along the way, but condensed into a 6 to 7 hour session." Close quote. Look, I'm so confident that this will take your mixes to the next level that if you can't get a killer mix within 30 days, I'll give you a full refund, no questions asked. So if you're ready to take your mixes to Grammy-winning quality, then go to ultimatemixingmasterclass.com and start now by checking out the free preview of the ultimate snare mixing trick. And I'll see you at the front row table of the Grammys. Cheers. Do you find that you have to keep reminding yourself of what sounds good in your room? Do you have to go back to your source references, like your favorite records, a lot and keep resetting your
references
brain
are definitely cool. If you're jumping, so sometimes in a day, I might work on 4 songs that are 4 different genres.
Right.
And if that happens, I usually, depending on how different the songs are, I may not have to, but sometimes it is definitely helpful to pull up a reference and be like, all right, we're doing the indie thing. It's like, it's dark. Don't add high end, don't add high end, don't add high end.
Right.
Because the thing before it was some pop thing that's like bright as daylight.
Right.
And they want it that way. And the next thing, it sounds like there's just a low pass filter over the mix. And you're like, okay, but this is what they want. So sometimes you do have to kind of reset okay, here's what we're aiming for.
Yeah.
But usually you hear enough music and you work on it for long enough, you can hear the song and okay, this is the vibe that they want,
And then what about the process of finding a reference that is appropriate? Do you find that you have your own references and your opinion is best, or do you find that it's really helpful to get the artist to send you stuff that seems like a reference for them? Or does that just confuse the issue because they don't even have a clue how to send you? Like they'll just be like, "I love this record," and you're like, "It sounds nothing like their record."
I think, yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends because I certainly have quite a few references of songs that I think sound really great in pretty much every genre that I'll come to if I just want like a nice reset, And but artists almost always are very willing to give you references, especially if I'm working on somebody's album and I just kind of preview through a couple songs. I'm like, okay, this is cool. I could see this going in a couple different directions as far as like I could make it, maybe a little brighter, louder, more aggressive, or we could do kind of a more subdued, darker thing. And if I'm like, okay, this could go in one of 2 ways, I'll usually be like, hey, what do you see this final product looking like? Like, do you want this to be more like Radiohead, or do you want it to be more like, some like more modern indie thing, or not that Radiohead's an indie band at all, but you know what I mean? And so, yeah, sometimes getting references from people is helpful too.
All right. So let me ask you some clerical questions. How do you keep session names and versions organized and named? Let's use the studio one as an example. I discovered that was a little bit challenging for me as I was mastering my own records there. And I'm like, everything's called final master, like what do you call things? Because you send it and then they come back and want a revision.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever labeled anything with the word final unless someone specifically asks for it. I just start with the number 1 and then go up from there. Let's dig in a little deper and forgive me if I put you on the spot too much since you have the screen up in front of you. But you've got the artist name, you've got the album name, you've got the song name. The song they delivered you is probably called Mix 5 with a date on it or whatever. It's got some like wacky name to it. You're loading this stuff into PreSonus. What names are you putting in there as you do it, just so that you're starting with the right organization? I just label everything as the song title, and then master 1, master 2, and you start with master 1.
You've got a PreSonus session. You have to start a new project. What's that called?
Oh yeah. Just the artist name and the date. I don't
You don't
label.
even know what the album name is.
No, because the
album's not out yet.
Some people will do. Well, half the time I don't know. Like, no, I don't even get told the album name sometimes, because if it's a digital release, you're not really inputting.
Let's just assume that we're working on a collection of songs in this example too, because I know a single is a little different.
I just label it by the artist and the date.
Okay, so that's the project is artist and date,
and then every time, and I kind of have my own series of folders that's in like chronological order throughout the year. And so if somebody sends me a new project, it'll go into a new folder, and then it's the artist and the date. So that, kind of designates which one was which.
And then you've got a collection of mixes that they sent you.
Right.
And before you even start, did you drag those into the same artist date folder?
Yes.
On Finder?
Yeah. So
and then you just drag them into PreSonus, and they just sort of like line up in the order of...
In the order that they told me, yeah.
And it might, I can't remember if it duplicates a copy of that somewhere or not, but it might be worth being aware of if you're trying to not fill up your hard drive.
Yeah, I don't think it does. I think if you just drag and drop stuff from Finder into most DAWs, it just pulls the audio from that spot, but it doesn't create a copy unless you're converting it.
Right.
Typically.
And Pro Tools does have a preference in there. If you switch it, it'll automatically... You
can turn that on as a preference.
And I've turned that on before because I'd rather fill up disk space than get burned by it not being where I thought it was.
Oh, totally.
Later,
yeah. I just leave it in one place, and then I just back everything up later.
Yeah. Okay. So now we've dragged our songs in, and the songs have these funny names. So do you rename them right there in the PreSonus session, or did you rename them before you organize them in your folder?
You can do it either way. It's, it's kind of... It's 50-50. You can do it. It doesn't matter. You're renaming it either way. So
okay. So now you've worked on these 5 songs and you're ready to send it off. Do you do a save at that point or a save as? Do you match the PreSonus session with this export of 5 songs that are going to be in a folder? And I think it calls it releases, which is a little bit of a premature label.
Yeah, it is.
Right?
It is. I bounce stuff usually directly to, I will bounce stuff directly to Dropbox in like a Dropbox folder, and then I'll make a copy of it and put it in the artist folder so that I have an offline copy and an online copy. But I send it directly to Dropbox, which then I will send them a link to.
Okay, so that they're getting... And what is that folder called? Is that called like releases and it has the artist name or something?
So I'll make a folder for each artist, and then in the folder for each artist, I'll make a folder for each project that I do for that artist. And then in that folder, I'll make, this project first masters, this project second master, whatever I need to do, So that's... As far as how I label stuff, that's what...
Right. So, but PreSonus, when you export, I think it, what do they call it? Is it called digital release or something?
Yeah.
And so then you select that and it'll let you check off all the songs that are in your mastering session that you want to include or not include. So if you just wanted to do one of the songs, you could uncheck the others or just leave them all checked. You can also choose what file size, format it is. So is this like a high-res file? Is this an MP3? Is this just a 1644 wave file?
True, yeah. So I will send people standard waves, which is 16-bit 441K. And then after they're done, I'll usually send them full-res files of whatever they sent me.
Right. Well, why bounce the full-res ones until they've approved everything?
Right, yeah. And for the most part, they're going to use the standard WAV files for everything, like for digital distribution. But I mean, you can upload high-res files to digital. So some people want to do that, and they can if they want to. But then also just so they have the high-res files for whatever.
And that high-res file, will it only be as high as the original mix that they sent you?
Yeah. I don't upsample anything. Some people do. Some people do the whole like 2-computer thing where they play the mix and then they re-record everything at 96K after it passes through their analog gear. I don't do that. I keep everything at whatever sample rate it was sent to me at.
Okay. So now you've got this Dropbox folder that's got, the export of today's master, and it's called Master 1 or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Now, what happens when you come back tomorrow and they want a revision on something? What's your process? Do you open Master 1 and do a save as, or does it automatically do versions for you and you keep track of it that
You
way?
can do the versions thing. I think because I came up in the before versions existed, I will just duplicate the session and rename it today's date instead of yesterday's date. And
So
that's
right in
that's
Finder, you duplicate
Yeah,
it first. You just
yeah.
drag a copy to itself and then give it a new name. And
Yeah,
then start
that's what
working
I
from
do
there.
anyway.
All right.
And
then when you export the releases, you export all the files on day 2, does it give it that new name so that you know and find it, or do you find that you have to go into Finder and sort of rename the folder before sending? I told you I was going to put you on the spot.
I'm trying to. I don't know without seeing it in front of me.
Right. But you'll check.
I'm sorry. I'm not entirely sure what you're asking, but I kind of know.
I'm just thinking about the really mundane aspect of keeping track of this stuff and naming it, and knowing which version, because it's, in my world, it turns into a clusterfuck so fast. And I send mixes to the band and they're commenting and they don't even know what mix they're commenting on or which version, stuff like that. And it turns into and plus in my world with my band, it gets up to version 10 and stuff of things. And quickly you lose track.
It's a little bit different. I've never been anywhere near a version 10. I think version 4 is maybe the highest I've ever gone. Mastering rarely needs that many revisions. It's usually either the first thing I send them, or maybe there's one revision. It's the second thing. That's typical. It's usually handled either right away, or you do one round of revisions for them. It's honestly kind of rare that it even goes to a third round. But it's totally fine if it does, because sometimes what you have as an idea of what something should be is a little bit different than what the producer or artist has in mind, and so you have to kind of either meet them in the middle or just go totally the way that they want to go, and that's okay.
It's like working with a great session musician. They kind of nail it on the first or second take versus somebody who's figuring it out for the first time might do a bazillion of it and, have to figure out which one was actually good. Let's see. Let's talk about some of the other tools, or let's talk about the order of things we might explore in teaching ourselves how to mess with this stuff too. What is the order of events for you? So you bring in the stuff, you look at it in RX first, or when you decide that it needs to be looked at. And then the very first move might be some EQ.
So yeah, I think I'll usually pull everything. If let's say it's a group of songs, I'll pull the songs all into a session, and I usually try to listen to everything first before I do anything else.
All the way through?
Yeah. Because I want to know what it is that I'm doing, and I'll make notes as I'm listening. And sometimes while I'm listening, if one song is way obviously louder than the other one, I'll try to ballpark volume match everything so that I can listen to everything in sequence and I'm not just turning the volume knob way up or down for certain songs. So
you ballpark level match.
I'll ballpark level match.
And that would
but that's the only thing that I do.
Would that just be
start with.
In PreSonus, for example, if you click on one of those songs in the lane down below, there's a line across it.
You can do it that way.
Square and turn it up or down, or the fader. Also, I think
I've never used the fader.
Okay.
I'll just use the.
See, this is really helpful because anybody who's in the studio, they're like, "What the hell? Does anybody use this fader?" And then there you go.
No, I'll just trim the tracks up or down, basically, or I mean, you could also put a limiter on a song and pull the threshold down or something however you want to level the volume, and get everything to the same volume roughly. Listen through, and then I make notes on physical notes on a notepad.
And do you begin with the song in the proper order? Do you get the band to tell you what order they want things?
Yeah. Well, if they do, then yes. Sometimes people don't, because sometimes people don't even know. They're like, man, I've got this EP. I'm like, cool, what's the song order? They're like, we don't really know yet. I'm like, okay.
All right.
And then you just try to make them all as similar as you can.
It's going to be alphabetical, guys.
That is, I do work on it alphabetical, but I don't give them numbers. I take the numbers off.
You make sure that, see, that's another thing, right? So
If they haven't given me a song order, I don't
you're
apply
taking
numbers.
it for granted, but this stuff's pure gold for us. So like, because if you export it from PreSonus, it's going to put numbers on.
You actually haven't. There's an option in the export window. You can add the artist name to the file or not. You can add the song number to the file or not. And so like you can just, when you're exporting it, you can get rid of the numbers.
Okay, great.
If like, if it's like 3 songs and like these are 3 singles, they're not going on an EP, you can just get rid of the numbers because they don't matter. And but yeah.
But so you'll listen, then do you like to sit perfectly still on the speakers for that listen, or is this more like you're getting your day started and you can just listen through all the music and grab your coffee and you're getting a feel for the record?
I'm usually just sitting in my spot at my desk listening through. But again, I'm making notes as I'm listening. So
right,
like if if I hear, and I'll try to write down, if I hear some like pops or things that I need to go into RX and fix, I try to write down like timestamps of where those are.
Yeah.
So that then I don't have to guess later or, go back again. I can just skip to those spots and like handle it when I go fix it. So, I make notes, do that kind of thing. And then once all that's handled and I've done if I have to do any edits or whatever, then I'll go in and I start with the first song and I kind of build a chain for the first song, which is a combination of, for me, it's usually a combination of plugins and the gear that I have. But it depends, sometimes it's just plugins. Sometimes the gear isn't necessary because...
Are you using analog EQ as well in your studio?
I do have an EQ, which again, I sometimes use and I sometimes don't.
Yeah.
But it's, just go through that, kind of build the chain for the first song.
But like
the first song in mind?
What are some typical things? Like, are chains 10 plugins long or are they just a few plugins?
It depends, Sometimes it's 1 plugin and then some gear, and then sometimes it's only 1 piece of gear and it's 10 plugins. Gear
meaning analog.
Yeah, sorry.
Gear. And is that something you put on an insert?
So
you
can,
in so that it just goes. You don't have to export it over to the thing and record
correct.
It back
in. It's basically just like an insert. Okay. In Studio One, it's called Pipeline. That's what Pipeline. And then you select your inputs and outputs and kind of do that kind of thing. And then you can put your analog, or I can put my analog stuff or whoever wherever you want in the chain. Usually I do it first, but sometimes I'll use a couple like corrective plugins before that if there's like a crazy amount of low end or something, or if I want to use like if I want to like tame some high end off of something before it goes out into the, sometimes I'll do that first. But a chain for me is usually like, I will usually, if there's like high end issues, like too much high end, it's very sibilant or very bright or whatever, I will use like a high frequency limiter first. That's the first thing that I do. And then I'll use some EQ, and then I'll start the like compression and dynamics processing side of it, which is usually 1 compressor doing very little, and then it's usually like a series of limiters, sometimes a clipper if it needs it, and then sometimes I'll put saturation, the first level of saturation before a limiter, and then sometimes I'll do some saturation after the limiters, and then you still have a final limiter to kind of catch it all. I know it sounds weird,
it's
but
fascinating.
And everyone's process can be different. I'm just trying to give some examples of like what I do plugin wise.
We listened to your playlist. It sounds fucking great. So let's learn a little bit about this. This podcast is proud to present Recording Studio Rockstars Academy. Are you ready to take your recording, mixing, and mastering to the next level and make your best record ever? Then visit the Academy to find the course that's right for you. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Then check out Rockstars of Drums to learn how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a professional Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Or if you're ready to start mastering your own records at home, then check out Rockstars of Mastering, where I walk you through exactly how I master my own records using nothing but plugins. Plus, I take you into a world-class mastering studio, Sterling Sound, to meet with Ryan Smith and hear how he professionally mastered my record, Skadoosh, for release to streaming platforms. That's the music you hear on this podcast, Rockstars. And if mixing is your focus, then check out my free mixing course, Mix Master Bundle, where I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins in Pro Tools. Plus, you get a look at how I recorded everything in my studio and multi-track downloads for you to practice mixing and even upload to your website if you want. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/academy to get started now. All right, so I guess if you can use the outboard gear on this pipeline thing too, then that begs the question, these settings won't work for every song,
right?
This 5-song thing. So you might have to bounce and process that one song and get it ready along with the other songs before you can put them all together.
Usually, if I have like for a project, and I'm using my gear, which is like, I don't have like a million things. I'm usually only using 3 or 4 pieces on something, and so I usually will kind of set those to a place where I think it sounds good, and usually I can use that for all of the songs as long as I have level matched them, like as long as they're not hitting it too hard or whatever.
Because a lot of times songs share characteristics with each other,
and often are like mixed by the same person and kind of have similar vibes.
Yeah.
If they need drastically different processing, yes, I'll record each one individually and then pull them all in after I've like printed them all that way. But sometimes I can just kind of put my gear kind of on everything, and then make adjustments to each song individually so that it's all hitting it the right way. And then, after the gear, some kind of final like limiting and setting the volume just right to be all similar and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's wild. And then, so you have these plugins that go with each track in PreSonus, but then you have, I forget what it calls it. Maybe it's just pre-fader and post-fader areas, but I think of them more as master section plugins.
Right.
So what might you find useful over in those areas? Is there like one that is a limiter that just lets you raise the volume of the whole record all at once, and that's about the only plugin over there, or are there other things?
I usually all I will typically put on my master everything channel is just a limiter that has, it honestly isn't even doing anything. I don't have the threshold pulled down at all. It's just there to catch, anything that maybe if I'm doing something weird, like adding some process at the end after a limiter, it'll catch those kind of little tiny peaks. And also it just kind of serves as like what my overall ceiling is going to be, which, usually you'll set your ceiling at, people have different ideas of where to set it. I usually go for a -0.3, and I feel like is a pretty safe place. A lot of people say, to go for -1 or, -0.5 or something, but
right.
I usually go -0.3, and that's fine. And
is that true peak limiting? Is that something
I use a true peak limiter only at the very end? Not all the limiting before that, I do not use true peak. Some people don't use a true peak limiter at all. But I do just at the very end. And again, it doesn't really do anything. It's just sometimes we'll catch 0.1 dB of something that's like an intersample peak.
Right.
And,
and just to quickly say what true peak limiting is, it's a thing that says we're setting our level to be a certain loudness at the end of, at the end of this process. But in some playback systems, that much loudness will overshoot based on what's playing it back in the car, or the phone, whatever. And so therefore we want to be aware of like, what's the true actual peak after the playback device. And so it's just kind of measuring it and thinking about it differently, because you don't want to create a distortion on some playback systems, right? That's kind of the intention.
Right. And that's why I use it at the end, is just to catch because they're not hugely problematic. It's just really small little, overshoots that happen that you're just trying to tame. And it's usually not super audible either.
Have you ever had an example where you it wasn't there and then you added it later and it actually solved a thing that you were aware of out there? I mean, I'm sure there's some aspects. I mean, there's the aspects to all of what we do, some of which we hear every moment we're working, and some of them we're like, just in case, you know?
Yeah. No, it's just kind of a just in case plugin that just sits there at the end and lets me set my ceiling, and like I know it'll grab something if something's wild, but I just always leave it there, so I don't know.
Okay, next part of the question is assembling songs. So you've got a 10-song record and you've got song spacing. That used to be such a big thing in mastering, and now I don't know what to make of it. Is it still a thing? Does song spacing still matter between songs? Will we even, let's just forget CDs for a sec. Let's just assume somebody's not making a CD, they're uploading this for streaming. When and how will we experience those song spacings on a record? And so that we need, and what are we doing to try and get those right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I still think that how an album flows is really important. And I think really is a cool part of the album listening experience, especially things like if you can work in a couple seamless transitions where the songs overlap a little bit. One song, the reverb tail's fading out, and the next song, you hear some noise come in, and it's like, to me, that stuff's cool, And when I listen to a record and I hear that, I'm like, this is cool. You know, like I didn't even know the next song had started yet. Like, this is fun. So I love that stuff. Obviously, you have to either have the artist either has to already have that in mind, or if you hear something that's like, hey, this might be cool, I will always ask them before I do that if they haven't asked me to do it. Because typically people want songs to just kind of stand on their own, and then, have
one song finishes and the next
one song
starts.
Finishes, maybe it breathes for 1 second or 2 seconds. That's what I'm talking about.
That breath is a real thing when you're listening to an album down. And sometimes I've thought about that, and it's like, sometimes we hear the rhythm we're still feeling the rhythm of the song that just ended, and then we're wanting that next one to land on a beat.
I totally do that. Not for all genres or whatever, but yeah, if I do that sometimes where, a song ends and then I'll give it what would have been 2 bars of space, which often is only, a couple seconds or whatever. And then the next song, starts right away. Or if it's not a rhythmic thing, but just a general note on spacing. If, you've got some ballad that's like really quiet and it ends and fades out, often having like a few seconds of just nothingness for that to breathe before your next song, which is maybe kind of loud, comes in. That's something to keep in mind too. But I mean, really, I'm just doing it by feel. I don't have exact numbers in mind, but I'm just listening through the album and trying to keep the transitions short enough so that where there's not like dead air. But also sometimes if there needs, I will just add blank space to the end of songs sometimes. If the song, there's the last note and then it ends and there's only half a second.
Okay, so back in the day, you'd export your master file, and that would go over to the CD and get pressed, and you'd have these single songs, and there's some like .3mu file or some weird thing that I don't ever know what that is.
That's a playlist file.
Playlist file, okay. And then do you have to export something specific that also gets uploaded to your streaming services for those the spacing to be right between all these
No,
songs?
it's just, so you're just setting, all the songs in sequence, and then you're, figuring out how they overlap or have space or whatever. And the way the song renders is just based on where your track markers are. So that song, like if you have 2 songs that seamlessly overlap, if you play song 1 of those 2 songs, and you just let it end without song 2, it'll just abruptly cut off at the end because it wants to go into the next song, which is like the finished idea of the end of the song. And so it doesn't, like streaming and whatever, it doesn't mess with that stuff. They just let your song is whatever it is.
So the streaming,
timing wise.
Yeah, I'm trying to picture it. So like if you play back an album on streaming, it'll finish the song, and does it insert 2 seconds before the next song starts?
It does not, unless you have, there used to be like an iTunes setting where you could add space between songs. But these days playback is all gapless by default. is what it's called.
Oh, okay. So you end one song and start the next one. It's going to just start the next one immediately after the first one ends. So there isn't really a way to leave a breath in between them.
Well, what I'm saying is like the song that I export will play. Like if I export two songs and I've added the space is now part of the song because I've rendered it to be part of the song. So then,
so song A goes into song B. Song A sort of fades out and then has a little bit of space on the end of the audio file.
Yeah, it's literally just blank seconds.
That's literally how you space the two songs.
Yes.
There you go. Right.
Sorry, it took me Now I finally came back around to what you were actually asking.
Well, I'm thinking about like DDP files.
You're thinking of CDs. So
CD spacing.
Yeah, you can literally just put nothingness space in between songs and it would have printed it on a CD. But for if you're talking specifically about Studio One, you've got the WAV file and then you've got the kind of the bar over the song that shows the song. You can just drag the bar further out, and that's what adds.
And that gives you your space.
That adds space.
Okay, cool.
Blank space.
There you go. Awesome. All right. Well, we've been going for a good long stretch. So let me go to our closing question.
All right.
Which I haven't asked you since episode 13, but I'll ask it again. This is hypothetical. We get to take the Wayback Studio machine and you go back in time and find young Joe, who just got a call from some dude named Lidge, who's doing a weird a studio in a what? A hay bale? No. And you say, no, you just go back and find yourself in earlier times. And you say, listen, Joe, I've come back to give you this one bit of advice. Here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the studio yourself one day. What advice? It's a long question, but basically, what advice would you like to go back and give yourself if you could?
Dang. I think the advice I would give myself is to just keep working to get better, but also trust your instincts. Because I think what has cost me time and made things more difficult for me over time is like when I, and again, when you're young and you're starting out, your instincts are not always going to be right. But and that's why I said you have to be willing and able to learn and grow. I mean, you learn from just doing it. So you just keep doing it. You learn from people. If you don't know how to do it, you learn from people that do know how to do it. And you just have to keep trying and working at it. But I think your instincts are kind of one of your most important, if not your most important tool, is that once you've kind of built up your skill set, which, I mean, even when I was starting out, I obviously didn't have the knowledge or ability that I do now, but I did, I think, have some good ideas even when I was young. But I would second guess myself to death. I'd spend 4 hours mastering one song because I'm like, I think this sucks. Does this suck? I think this sucks. Does this suck? And in reality, I wasn't making it better after like the first hour or two. Just like spiraling for no reason. So, just trust your instincts and let it be what it's going to be. And then if it's not perfect, that's okay. You're going to learn from that. The most valuable lessons I've learned throughout my career have been from me making just gigantic mistakes, just like absolutely ruining, I'm being dramatic, not ruining something, but just not doing my best work and then realizing it and being like, oh man, I kind of blew it. I need to pay more attention to X, And so, but I mean, that's how you learn. That's how we all learn and get better. It's like everyone's going to make mistakes. But I think it's important to trust your instincts and, do what you believe serves the song best.
Well, I think that when you pointed out that the first thing you do is sit down and just take notes across the song, I think that's such a great lesson because you literally are only relying on your instincts at first. Just what do you instinctively want to say about the song? What does it need? What hits you? And it gives you a starting place instead of feeling like you just got to start by doing tons of stuff to something.
Right. And I think like in the same way that if you're, how in you've got a live band in the studio, you're press and record, that first take that they do always has some magic to it. It's not always the one that you keep, but there's always something like the energy of the first take. It's everyone's going at it with their fresh ideas, with the energy and stuff, and I think some of that can still apply, to even all the way to mastering. It's like I listen to it, I make some notes, I like do a bunch of processing, like whatever I'm doing first is almost always my best foot forward, And then after that, I'm just, splitting hairs sort of after that.
Right.
But like I would say the majority of the work I do to a song is done in like 10 minutes. And then, I usually will spend about an hour on a song. And so the rest of the time is just me maybe going back and doing some edits or looking at a specific section and like, okay, how do I figure this out or whatever. But I think the bulk of of what I can do best happens, right away.
That's awesome. Well, Jude, thanks for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars once again. Let the rock stars know, where can they go find you online, and if they're ready to make their record sound like a hit, like the rest of your albums. What should they do?
GarageMasters.net is my website, or I'm on Instagram at Joe Hutchinson.
Right on. Well, dude, thank you once again for hanging with us. And
yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening.
This was fun.
Look forward to coming over and seeing your cool new mastering rooms.
Yeah, anytime.
All right, man. Thanks, dude. Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our awesome sponsors who help make this episode possible. Lewitt, Grace Design, Adam Audio, Native Instruments, and Isotope. And remember, at isotope.com and nativeinstruments.com, use the coupon code ROCK10 for 10% off any plug-in purchase. If you enjoyed Recording Studio Rockstars, please check out our sponsors using the links in our show notes, because it's a great way to help support the show. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio. They're gonna help you make your best record ever. I would also like to thank our fantastic team here at Recording Studio Rockstars, Vlad Weselchenko, Braden Stremming, and Liz Hulitskaya. Thanks so much for listening, Rockstars, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.